Democracy and Relativism. Reinventing Critical Theory. Democracy and Relativism. A Debate. Cornelius Castoriadis. Translated by John V. Garner. London, New York. Foreword. John V. Garner. The desire and the capacity of citizens to participate in political activities are themselves a political problem and a political task. Cornelius Castoriadis. This book translates the December 1994 meeting between philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, 1922 to 1997, and the contingent of Francophone intellectuals known as MOS, extant 1981-present. 1 Castoriadis, born in the Ottoman capital in 1922, had lived in France since 1945 and had developed by the time of this debate a reputation not only for his post-Marxist political project of autonomy but also for his ever-broadening philosophical inquiries into psychology, the sciences and social sciences, and ancient Greek thought, among other areas. MOS contributors, interested in social theory broadly, had shown some interest in Castoriadis early on. 2 As the text records, this dialogue began with Castoriadis's response to provocative questions sent by Alain Cale, central figure in MOS. The text of the dialogue as translated here stems from the debate's complete publication in book format in 2010. 3. The importance of this encounter for us will quickly become evident to the reader. Its relevance stems not only from the English-speaking world's increasing interest in the work of Castoriadis but also, and above all, from this dialogue's absolutely timely content. Here, I will link the dialogue's themes to 3 contemporary concerns before commenting, in closing, about matters of context and translation. Relativism and democracy today. At least 3 prevalent themes in the Castoriadis-MOS debate have important contemporary resonances. First, the debate contributes to discussions about the post-truth era through its exploration of the practical consequences of relativism. Second, it speaks to the need to reflect on our institutional-level commitments, e.g. to public spaces, to education, and so on, and on whether and how they enable genuine political engagement and dialogue. Third, it explores important examples of past political engagement, especially the example of Greek democracy, in a way that contextualizes our own era. Emphasis should be placed, in each case, on how the interlocutors model both a respectful form of dialogue and a non-authoritarian approach to intellectual questions. First, in an age miserably saddled with the epithet post-truth era, the dialogue's opening topic of relativism is timely. We can witness today a multitude of practical consequences relating to the notion that one selects at will one's own facts, e.g. contagions of deceptive memes, widespread distrust in the sciences, the return of collectively eradicated diseases, and so on. Castoriadis certainly recognizes what many relativists do, namely the uniqueness of each person and culture, the dangers in applying local norms transculturally, and the need to avoid trusting blindly in authority or taking one's own cultural norms to be necessary and inalterable. But in this dialogue and elsewhere he establishes a firm, non-relativist support for political programs that would help fulfill the universal promise of an autonomous society with autonomous individuals. This would be, in part, a society in which all people are positively empowered to question themselves and their laws, to deliberate effectively with others about the common good, and, as a collectivity, to establish effective institutions, e.g. ones that make possible their continuation in such practices. 5 Such a project of autonomy would even enable people to relativize these very commitments. Is this an impossible space for Castoriadis to occupy? This question had perplexed Alain Cale, Serge Latouche, and others for a long time. 6. For Castoriadis, one must begin by recognizing the historical fragility not only of autonomy and democracy but also of the very possibility of relativizing one's own understanding, perhaps defined as comparing oneself and one's culture with others in such a way that one sees those other practices as possible and as possibly better in significant ways. This task of making the familiar strange, or of breaking the closure of traditional thought, as Castoriadis calls it, is an important part, among many others, of the project of autonomy. 7. Yet relativizing in this sense is not the same thing as a relativism that would pretend all cultures are equally preferable. Such a relativism relies for its possibility on the historically contingent possibility to relativize in general. Now, when one relativizes in general, one performs, or practically activates, a preference for the possibility to relativize, an option not presently available to all. In doing so, one of course fails to activate many other cultural possibilities and also excludes those practices that presently oppose it. Yet, unlike the mere relativizer, the relativist goes further. Since relativism's possibility depends on the possibility to relativize generally, whenever the relativist claims that no culture is especially preferable, he or she in fact enacts a special preference for the historical possibility to relativize while ignoring or denying that preference at the same time. Hence, Castoriadis might be said to relativize relativism. But this move must be understood not as a dismissal of it but rather as a kind of protection of its underlying possibility. If relativism treats its own historical possibility as an exception to its rule of equal preferability, then Castoriadis instead promotes a universal inception of the broader possibility to relativize. That is, he affirms it as one distinct historical possibility, situates it among other possibilities, many of which are presently opposed to it, and defends its activation as one among many preferable parts of the larger project of autonomy that it helps enable. And by affirming that all should be enabled to potentially practice it, Castoriadis thereby commits himself to promoting it to others as an option and fighting against those cultural practices that would presently try to destroy it. 8. This move, critical but protective of relativism's underlying possibility, leads directly to Castoriadis's subsequent metaphysical and political points. First, Castoriadis is appropriately asked to clarify how he differs from Claude Lefort. After all, he had spent the early part of his career working with him, in Socialisme ou Barbarie and elsewhere, both struggled for decades against totalitarianism, both heralded versions of democracy, and Lefort had debated Mauss on an earlier occasion, with Castoriadis reportedly present. 9. Lefort, however, proposed a modern democracy that makes political power, held by the royalty in the old regime, into an empty space of conflict where no view is principally affirmed, i.e. a space of indeterminacy. 10. Castoriadis, by contrast, appears to see Lefort's position as pretending to affirm a political space of possibility that does not affirm any possibility, even itself. 11. Castoriadis, by contrast, argues that at the heart of democracy, precisely because it lies at the heart of being itself, is not indecision, nor an indefinite emptiness, but rather a positive creativity, i.e. a power to institute something definite, a power to create determinations. 12. Hence, when he promotes democracy, Castoriadis does not leave political possibilities indeterminate but rather affirms the positive exigency to enable each person to occupy the space of public self-determination, i.e. the creative, instituting social power itself. 13. Castoriadis thus speaks of true politics, la politique, as the assuming of responsibility for this original creation, and contrasts it with the typical political activity, le politique, of channeling, managing, organizing, or even resisting already instituted powers, e.g. state power, capitalist power, prejudices of the populace, and so on. True politics occurs when one shares publicly in creating definite, positive projects, thus questioning extant ones, inventing laws and self-limitations, thus questioning old ones, and establishing institutional arrangements that help each and all to assume that very practice. But since this possibility, i.e. of the public space, is historically fragile and rare, it follows that making institutional supports that nourish political engagement is required. We must invent or sustain the means encouraging political participation by all, even ones as simple as authentically open meeting places, libraries, schools, and so on. At this point, Castoriadis, and we too, must recognize many features of contemporary life that hinder participation in the instituting public power. These include traditional forms of political or cultural life that disallow or discourage public participation in legislating, or the questioning of extant legislation, contemporary modes of privatization and capitalistic domination, i.e. the manipulation of desires and public spaces as part of profiteering, failures to establish positive educational opportunities that facilitate collective participation, i.e. lack of paideia or education in autonomy, and so on. 14. At the individual level, blocks also appear due to widespread lack of interest, economic hardship, distraction by technological devices, psychological disorders, and so on, all of which are obviously problems, occurring as they do on a mass scale, linked at least partly with larger failures of politics. Thus, what is important about the social critique offered in this debate is that it is not motivated, neither in Castoriadis's case nor in the case of Moss, by a simple oppositional mindset, nor by a preference for the new or old for their own sake. It is motivated, on the one hand, Moss, by an understanding of the importance of basic human sociality and, on the other hand, Castoriadis, by a positive commitment to political participation, especially the lucid, overt, and dialogical asking of the question, what are the ends of human life? 15. Second, an additional contemporary challenge is presaged in this debate. 4. Correlative to the dishonest form of relativism mentioned above is a dishonest and destructive pseudo-individualism. Self-proclaimed individuals each express their individualism by all using the same devices, all absorbing the same news sources, all sharing the same memes, or the like. 16. Amidst this confused and false individualism, a sort of absorption in imagined communities is correlated. In some camps, the massively privileged proclaim themselves members of oppressed victim groups. In other camps, the slightest offense to a social norm immediately provokes a contagious flare-up of condemnations from those collectively more in the know. Elsewhere, students unite in support for the right of a prejudicial speaker, it's free speech, until protesters arrive, you're opposing free speech, and so on. 17. Such inversions or perversions of emancipatory strategies, of solidarity, and so on have opened the door for, among other things, hack intellectuals, emboldened by YouTube popularity, to sell base prejudice in the guise of evolutionary psychology, plain arrogance in the guise of recovering masculinity, or social heteronomy and authoritarian politics in the guise of retrieving the wisdom of our ancestors. In this sad climate, good examples of at least two practices are both needed and possible for us. On the one hand, we need examples of what we might call interlocutory individuals, i.e. people in process of achieving an individuality and character via engagements with others who challenge them, especially through intellectual engagements genuinely calling their own practical principles and identity into question. 18. Available to us, if we try, are opportunities for an individuality achieved not by materialist consumerism, nor by immersion in identity group echo chamber politics, nor by the nihilism of merely being against things, but instead by way of a genuine commitment to learning. 19. The widespread phenomenon of fact denial today cannot be challenged by blasting people with facts, one must first of all care to institute oneself as a learner. And such self-institution can be encouraged, enabled, and supported. Learning leans on dialogue, which, in turn, leans on primary sociality, CALE, as well as public spaces, research spaces, spaces for relativization, and so on, Castoriadis. We can ignore all of this and continue to be socially formed anyway, or we can positively form ourselves by establishing supports that help us become certain kinds of people, i.e. those who value learning over self-closure and new friends over new cars. Happily, this debate itself offers us some hope for the future of genuine dialogue. 20. On the other hand, we likewise need examples of responsible scholarship, especially regarding the inherently fragile remnants of past human intellectual engagements. In a time when our academy is heavily armed with much justified criticisms of the traditional Western canon, how might an old debate among privileged Westerners about the value of the West contribute to the promotion of global thinking, East and West, North and South? Without expanding heavily on the following points, I would just mention 3 heuristic principles we might draw from this debate on this theme. First, certainly, we must fight for increased, intensive scholarship on under-recognized and global contributions to effective thinking and effective autonomy. 21. Second, we must work against authoritarian co-options of intellectual remnants, e.g. texts, art, monuments, and social significations broadly, regardless of whether they have been traditionally included or excluded from any canon. Third, regarding the intellectual remnants that have already been disfigured to fit into the heteronomy propaganda machines, we must show that the lessons harbored in them actually obliterate, with their own arguments, any such authoritarian appeals, when they, frequently, do so. If these last 2 paragraphs together ring true, then perhaps we may benefit from rethinking the sorts of cultural background commitments that foster autonomy and dialogue. 22. The debate's third point of relevance for us today thus consists in its engagement with historical democracy, specifically the Greek example. 23. If, in the post-colonial context, Cale is particularly concerned to combat ethnocentrism, then Castoriadis argues that the Greeks of the 5th century BCE can assist us in just this struggle. The aspects of autonomy partly emergent there serve to undermine ethnocentrism, heteronomy broadly, and a fortiori any mindset that would embrace Greek culture as a kind of authority. Past instances of autonomy offer us not models but only germs, seeds, for further development. 24. Thus, contrary to any supposed superiority of things Greek, to any supposed special holistic harmony of Athenian society, Schiller, etc., or to any supposed pre-Platonic closeness with being, Heidegger, etc., Castoriadis highlights the fragility of the limited creation of autonomy there, which was itself emergent within an often troubling larger culture. 25. Nonetheless, some Greeks did partly achieve a lucidity regarding the contingency of their own and others' institutions. They glimpsed the ongoing nature of human self-creativity, individual and collective. This realization showed, in turn, that societies and individuals need to create and recreate the conditions that make it possible to recognize this self-creation and to ask what one is to do with it. What should our Constitution say? What, after all, is good or just? If we expect such questioning to impact the world, then we require not only the institutional supports for carrying out the at best temporary solutions we decide on but also, and primarily, the institutional supports for continuing to engage in this very act of self-questioning, deliberation, and so on. Hence, if philosophy is partly emergent in Greece as a commitment to endlessly rethinking things, also partly emergent there, correlatively, is the recognition that one must take up the practical activity of decisively determining things, i.e. making contingent, revisable decisions, institutions, and laws that are never once and for all. 26. Indeed, the most pressing lessons from ancient democracy are those displaying a positive institutional commitment to establishing each citizen as self-critical and competent to govern. 27. Surely such lessons are as valuable as ever today when our oligarchies proudly wear the mask of democracy. 28. By drawing on these elements, Castoriadis is in effect undermining the very claim that a historical example like Athens should be taken as an authority. 29. Historical examples offer us merely helpful remnants, ones that might assist in a new autonomous natality. 30. We always lean on them, even and especially when we call our inherited institutions into question, but they do not determine us. 31. At a different level, certainly, one factual matter might have been presented as more open for debate in Castoriadis's argument. Specifically, he makes the empirical claim that before the ancient Greeks there was no effective social project of autonomy. New evidence and arguments might arise on this issue. 32. That said, Castoriadis typically speaks of the Greeks as the first partial institution of effective autonomy. 33. This qualifier implies that one is not only personally self-critical, which is found in many global ancient traditions, but also that a culture builds material supports for autonomous thought and collective action. 34. It matters whether we build education systems, public displays for the laws, or, especially, the very spaces, literal or figurative, in which we can assemble and deliberate publicly, i.e. now globally, about what should even count as a public matter. 35. Effective autonomy requires that we exercise some such material commitments. Therefore, to truly challenge Castoriadis's empirical claim, one would need to show that earlier societies exhibited such material commitments. 4. We do have some such evidence in the Greek case. Beyond Castoriadis's examples, we might think, for instance, of the kalroterion machines, i.e. the devices used in democratic Athens for selecting certain office holders by sortition. Such tools obviously cannot make a society egalitarian, much less autonomous. A kalroterion in particular would not even be a necessary condition for democracy. But some such material supports are needed. 36. Hence, if evidence of a meaningful social and material commitment to autonomous self-institution arises elsewhere, then evidently the empirical claim must be amended. This would not be to say that effective democracy did not also begin in Greece, since independent creations can multiply instantiate autonomy. But it would disrupt any claim about chronological priority. Regardless, Castoriadis's key point here is that ethnocentrism is inconsistent with and positively undermined by the project of autonomy. Thus, when asked whether the partial autonomy in some medieval cities resulted from renewed interest in ancient Greek thought, Castoriadis reverses this suggestion and argues that the burgeoning autonomy drove the return to the Greeks. 37. After all, if ever one were to try to establish autonomy because some prior society did so, or because Castoriadis's work supports autonomy, then one would, by definition, take the law of action as dictated from elsewhere. That would be heteronomy. But, by contrast, to say that whenever we institute ourselves anew we must lean on established conditions, seek out additional extant ones, take them up, modify them, and so on, this is precisely what autonomous societies lucidly recognize. Tragically, mindless, even fascist, appeals to some supposed authority of our past frequently arise. We hear endless calls to follow our ancestors because they are our ancestors. 38. That is one reason why there remains a need for, among many other things, conscientious scholarship regarding the intellectual and political past of autonomous social institutions, i.e. scholarship that helps reveal how those very remnants undermine projects that appeal to them as authorities. But this also means that we must reject any simple solutions to the Western canon problem, especially anti-historical proposals. Anti-historical philosophy, for its part, risks merely enabling dominant, heteronymous imaginaries. It denies us the opportunity to relativize our era and thus to recognize, for one, our own destructive form of relativism. Context and translation. For more details on the context of this meeting, see the following introduction by Jean-Louis Prat. He reveals surprising links between the interlocutors and clearly depicts the historical backdrop, especially in relation to Marx and the post-1989 context. My additional contributions to grasping the context of the debate are the following 4 points. First, each figure in the volume has an individually interesting trajectory. Louis Basselet is an economist and professor at Université de Picardie Jules Verne. Alain Cale, in addition to co-founding Moss, is now Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Université de Paris X. Jacques Douat has authored several books on political philosophy and gift-related themes. Anne-Marie Fixat is teacher and wide-ranging researcher at Université de Caen. Serge Latouche, in addition to co-founding Moss, is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Université de Paris 11 and works largely on degrowth. Chantal Mouffe is Professor of Political Theory at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster and author of numerous works of political philosophy. Jean-Louis Prat is also a Moss contributor, by the way, and is the author of Introduction à Castoriadis, Paris, La Découverte, 2007. As for Castoriadis's broader trajectory, we should bear in mind that his thought was always responsive to the exigencies of the present. His earlier writings are marked by a heterodox Marxism and a special emphasis on workers' councils. During the period of Socialisme ou Barbarie, 1948 to 1967, however, he eventually broke with Marxism and in the 1970s leaned increasingly on psychoanalytical concepts both theoretically and as a practitioner. The work generally considered his magnum opus, The Imaginary Institution of Society, emerged in 1975, consisting partly of a major writing from 1964 to 1965. After his attainment of an academic position in 1979, he dealt in the 1980s with broader fields including Soviet studies, biology, ecology, Greek philosophy, and mathematics. By 1994, Castoriadis's work had come increasingly to emphasize the widespread decline of popular political engagement in the West. This decline corresponded to the rise of a culture of generalized conformism integral with a pseudo-individualism. 39 Blind trust in technological and scientific development, combined with popular concern only for the guarantee of pleasures, formed a culture of insignificance. 40 These critiques link up with Castoriadis's opposition in this debate to representative democracy, which he sees as promoting deferral of political responsibility to the representative class. The pseudo-justification for such abdication resides in the liberal imaginary of an ideal society as allowing and encouraging, whether inadvertently or by design, an apolitical private life. By contrast, Castoriadis continued to promote the exigency for popular investment in public self-institution, especially investment in the formation of a politically prepared populace. This project, he argued, requires investment in a truly public space, ecclesia, as kept distinct from the private, oikos, which in turn supports a mixed space, agora, not co-opted by either private interests or the state. 41 In this light, his emphasis on direct democracy, on display here, indicates not only his preference for a kind of regime but also his promotion of a new or renewed culture of active engagement, i.e. a culture both expecting and enabling the participation of everyone in self-institution and self-limitation. Second, note that section titles and editorial notes were added to the French edition. It should not be assumed that they were approved by Castoriadis since he had already passed. The reader should also keep in mind that this debate occurred orally and in person. I have attempted to capture the spontaneous nature of the language by, for example, retaining incomplete sentences on some occasions, using contractions, and so on. When interlocutors do use technical terms, I have generally appealed to existing translations of their work. Finally, bear in mind that quotations and anecdotes emerge on the fly, and thus some are inexact paraphrases, some tellingly so, or are unconfirmed. While the editors have supplied information on many citations, I have also added some notes or expanded upon existing ones, and these are marked transaction. All other notes are translated from the French, with English language publications substituted for the French ones when they exist in print. Third, there are several key terms readers should mentally mark. These fall into two categories: technical terms and terms presenting translation inexactitude. When such terms have arisen, footnotes have generally been added. In lieu of a separate glossary, what follows is a list of some of the more important of these terms with the location of the comment. All terms below are Castoriadis's unless otherwise marked. Agora, page 89, note 29. Anonymous collective, page 88, note 22. Arrangement, fr, disposition page 93, note 55. Creation, pages 87 to 88, notes 21 and 23. Affective autonomy, page 16. Ecclesia, page 89, note 29. Ensemblist identitary, page 20, note 30. Germ, fr, germ page 86, note 9. The gift, page 84, note 2, Moss terminology. Heteronomy, page XXIV, note 12 and page 21, note 40. Indeterminacy, fr, indetermination page 85, note 7, Leffer terminology. Instituting imaginary, page 88, note 22. Magistrate, page 93, Note 58. Oikos, page 89, Note 29. Paideia, page 92, Note 53. Phronesis, page 97, Note 83. The Political, Fr. Le Politique, page 86, Note 12. Politics, Fr. La Politique, page 86, Note 12. Primary Sociality, page 90, Note 33, Moss Terminology. Radical Imagination, page 88, Note 22. Rational Mastery, page 89, Note 30. Secondary Sociality, page 90, Note 33, Moss Terminology. I have not produced a special note for the term autonomy since the challenge of the whole volume is to develop an account of this term. For a set of invaluable essays elucidating Castoriadis's technical terminology more fully, see Susie Adams, ed., Cornelius Castoriadis, Key Concepts, London, Bloomsbury, 2014. Lastly, readers introducing themselves to Castoriadis's broader thinking might benefit from exploring the following resources. For a broad collection of Castoriadis's essays, see the Castoriadis Reader, ed. and Trans. David A. Curtis, Oxford, Blackwell, 1997. For wide-ranging intellectual conversations with Castoriadis, see Postscript on Insignificance, Dialogues with Cornelius Castoriadis, Trans. Gabriel Rockhill and John V. Garner, New York, Continuum, 2011, with a helpful introduction by Gabriel Rockhill. For a basic introduction to Castoriadis, see John V. Garner, Cornelius Castoriadis, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, 2011/2015, https://www.iep.utm.edu/cahistoria. For a more expansive introduction, see Susie Adams, Castoriadis's Ontology, Being and Creation, New York, Fordham University Press, 2011. For a study especially relevant for those with interest in the sciences, see Jeff Kluger, Castoriadis, Psyche, Society, Autonomy, Boston, Brill, 2009. Finally, for those who read French, indispensable is the expansive intellectual biography by François Dassy, Castoriadis, Unvi, Paris, La Découverte, 2014. For general bibliographical information, see the Agora International website, http://www.agorainternational.org, the Association Castoriadis website, http://www.castoriadis.org, and the bibliography of Claude Helbling, https://independent.academia.edu/Claude Helbling. In closing, I would like to thank Rowman and Littlefield International for their support in this project, the reviewers for their helpful suggestions, Gabriel Rockhill and the Villanova Translation Workshop for introducing me, 10 years ago, to the intrinsic value of translation, and above all my colleagues, friends, and family for their support, especially Charlie Strong for his valuable editorial suggestions. Thanks to Enrique Escobar for the kind offer of assistance and for elucidating several passages. Lastly, thanks above all to my wife Carly for her constant support and my daughter Eve for her helpful naps and playful interruptions. Note by the editors of the French edition: Enrique Escobar, Murdo Gondicas and Pascal Verney. A transcription of this encounter by Nikos Iliopoulos was previously published in numbers 13 and 14 of La Revue du Mois Semestriel, 1999. We reviewed a version that was corrected and completed by Jean-Louis Prat and introduced corrections of form into it, following the established practice for the publication of Castoriadis's seminars. We also reviewed and adjusted the original apparatus of notes. Introduction. Jean-Louis Prat. The meeting between Cornelius Castoriadis and the Moss Group, Mouvement Anti-Utilitariste dans les Sciences Sociales, or anti-utilitarian movement in the social sciences, may appear to have occurred both by necessity and by chance. It seems necessary in light of the sorts of questions raised by the Moss researchers and by the initiator of the journal Socialisme ou Barbarie. Yet it seems still more to have happened by chance, like the meeting mentioned by Diderot between Jacques the Fatalist and his master. One for this belated meeting, one Saturday in December 1994, does not have the convenient and conventional character of a university colloquium, and Castoriadis, before taking his place in what Bourdieu calls the intellectual field, spent a long period in the universe of extreme left militants. 2. This was a subgroup situated at a great distance from the university milieus where Moss had been anchored since its creation. As its co-founder Alain Cale tells it, Moss was constituted in 1981 after a colloquium on the theme of the gift. 3. In the course of the event he had remarked, along with Gerald Berthod, that numerous contributors had been of accord in reducing the gift to a utilitarian strategy, even concluding that the gift does not exist. 4. It seemed as if they were unaware of Marcel Mauss's thought and his famous The Gift. 5. It presents the gift as a total social fact in which the dynamic of society is deployed and in which one finds expressed the triple obligation to give, to receive the gift, as a return of the favor, and to surpass it with a counter-gift, in which the desire to save face appears. It is an agonistic system in which prestige counts infinitely more than mercantile interests. Even if the occasion served as a pretext and if, we may believe, something like Moss would have been born regardless, whatever the circumstances were, the anecdote justifies the way the acronym Moss invokes the memory of Marcel Mauss as part of the project of a critique of utilitarianism in the social sciences. This project of critique occurs in the social sciences, since it was shared by anthropologists, sociologists, and economists, though it was also bound to inspire philosophers, specifically readers of Alexander Kojève and Georges Baudelot such as Jean-Luc Boileau or Jean-Louis Cherlaniax. These are thinkers who in their own works made conversant the agonistic gift, the Nietzschean critique of Platonism, and the desire for recognition. 6. Readers of Castoriadis will find here the familiar theme that had played, and was still playing at the start of the 1990s, a role in his critique of Marxism. In a text cited below in the footnote, he mentions the Kwekwe indigenous people who amass riches in order to be able to destroy them. 7. This is the famous potlatch studied by Franz Boas, which served as the basis for Marcel Mauss's research. Some myopic Marxists, writes Castoriadis, scoff when one cites these examples, which they consider to be ethnological curiosities. But if there is an ethnological curiosity here, it is precisely these revolutionaries who have elevated the capitalist mentality into an eternal content of a human nature, everywhere the same. 8. Yet Castoriadis's writing here goes back to the 1960s, to an era when Marxism was, for a master as well known as Jean-Paul Sartre, an unsurpassable horizon. 9. Mauss itself emerged at the start of the 1980s, after the collapse of Marxism, which was situated in the middle of the 1970s, according to the authors of French philosophy of the 60s. 10. The Maussians, nevertheless, were not unaware of Marx, as Alain Cale highlights in a text from 1997 entitled De Marx à Mauss sans passer par Maurras. 11. He recounts that all those who were in the beginning and still are today the principal pillars and animators of Mauss had a Marxist past. This was not a small group Marxism, and it was one often more academic than properly militant, but there was nevertheless a Marxist past. And in a sense their adherence to a movement aligned with Marcel Mauss, while it consummated the definitive rupture with institutional Marxism, also signified a sort of fidelity to the Marxist ideas which had been their own. 12. Notice that Castoriadis, by the time he had met up with Mauss, had already long before broken in a very radical way with every form of Marxism, no matter how heterodox. This is perhaps not the case with Mauss, since, according to Cale, even if Marx was almost no longer cited or specifically commentated upon within its ranks, what characterizes the experience of Mauss, in opposition to the majority of authors named above, i.e. Cornelius Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, Marcel Gauchet, Pierre Clastres, Guy Debord, Jean Baudrillard, and Karl Polanyi, is precisely its reticence to burn bridges with the central Marxian aspirations, i.e. its refusal to throw out the baby of radical hope, or rather the hope for a certain radically, with the bathwater of totalitarianism. 13. This indicates a divergence, even if one adds that there is a connection to be clarified, namely that the Marxism Mauss took as inspiration was a seriously revised one, i.e. one that was corrected, at once, by the tradition of thought that was developed by Claude Lefort and Cornelius Castoriadis, from Socialisme ou Barbarie through Textures and then Libre, along with Marcel Gauchet and Pierre Clas, passing through the intensities of the Internationale Situationiste and of Jean Baudrillard, as well as through the humanist socialism and historical heterodoxy of Karl Polanyi. 14. In the era of Socialisme ou Barbarie, Lefort and Castoriadis doubtless represented a seriously revised and corrected Marxism. But each of them, following his own path, broke with the rationalist and determinist postulates of historical materialism by elaborating kinds of thinking that were no longer situated within the horizon of Marxism. Even so, Mauss's Marxist connection could slip by unnoticed. After all, the critiques it formulated against utilitarianism, the axiomatic of interest, or also the explication of social practice through rational, economic, interests, which reigned supreme everywhere in the social sciences in the 1970s and 1980s, could only cast a profound doubt over all that remains of utilitarianism in the heart of Marxism and, more specifically, over the explanation of history solely through the reality of material and economic interests. In the eyes of Marxists and orthodox materialists, nothing could appear more radically anti-Marxist than this refutation of the axiomatic of interest as well as of its supposed capacity to explain social action positively and of its pretension to judge normatively. 15. Aloncale presents this antagonism, between vulgar Marxisms and the heretics who called it into question, as an exacerbation of the tension that traverses Marxism between two ways of reading history in general and economic history in particular. 16. This critique of orthodox Marxism, even while it intends to remain faithful to the original inspiration of Marxism, calls to mind in many respects what Castoriadis developed in 1964 in Marxism and Revolutionary Theory. 17. In that text he shows that despite pretty expressions like the emancipation of the workers will be the work of the workers themselves, Marxism appropriated for itself the bourgeois conception of history and of society. 18. Its representation of history could only have validity for what happened during a few centuries in a tiny strip of earth around the North Atlantic. 19. In effect, a theory that pretends to explain the history of human societies through the development of productive forces is not talking about history in general but only about the history of capitalism. 20. These few quotations seem to us to attest, if not to a perfect identity of viewpoints, at least to a very close proximity in the perception of the problems between Castoriadis and the Maussian researchers, whether anthropologists, economists, or sociologists. This proximity does not, however, exclude the existence of serious disagreements, which are expressed in the text that you are going to read, a transcription of a debate between Castoriadis and the members of Mauss. These disagreements, moreover, also traverse Mauss. On this point, Jean-Luc Boileau recalled, during another debate where he represented Mauss, that this was by no means a monolithic group. He was pleased to attribute two popes to the Church of Mauss, i.e. the Pope Aloncale and the anti-pope Serge Latouche, without excluding the possible appearance of an arch-heretic. 21. The subsequent meeting, which would happen 3 years later in December 1994, depicts these two as properly opposed to one another on themes of universalism and relativism, of direct democracy and the representative system, and concerning the very idea of an autonomous society compared to a society against the state as defined in the work of Pierre Clas. Note that, on these themes, the Pope Aloncale finds himself very close to Claude Lefort and Pierre Clas, while the anti-pope Serge Latouche is more amenable to the positions of Castoriadis. Chantal Mauve, it seems to me, defends the orthodoxy of political science against the totalitarian slide she sees surfacing in direct democracy. As for Jacques Douhet, who kept company with Castoriadis when they each collaborated for the journal Textures, his personal evolution, under the influence of Kolakowski and Levinas, distanced him so far from Castoriadis's theses that the idea of autonomy came to no longer even make sense to him. This is confirmed by a text he devoted to the thought of Levinas. There he describes autonomy as a form of freedom removed from all responsibility. A permanent temptation of the West in its conception of freedom as pure autonomy, detached from every bond, released from all responsibility. 22. It is embodied by the mythical figure of Gyges, a character he describes as an object of mistrust and reprobation. He is the very incarnation of a pure freedom detached from every bond, of an attitude of flight from his responsibilities. 23. Like Ferry and Reinat in the book they dedicated to Castoriadis, i.e. 68-86 Itinéraires de l'individu, he reduces autonomy to a process of emancipation of the individual with regard to traditions. 24. He does not envision the collective autonomy of a community that institutes its nomos, its law, instead of receiving it from a transcendent authority. But let us dwell rather on a previous debate in which Castoriadis participated, before the one that will occupy us here, but from which the popes of Moss were absent. 25. We are in May 1991 and the Association of the Friends of the Library Soramps, the major university bookstore in Montpellier, have organized a colloquium in the city on three grand themes: democracy as violence, the end of history, in the East, another Europe. The choice of the three themes was of course tied to the questions that were sparked after the fall of the Berlin Wall about the future of a regime, the hardest and most fragile of regimes, as Castoriadis had said in 1982, that Gorbachev was still trying to save by proceeding with reforms, the dynamic of which he could not control. These interrogations had already crystallized around the publication of a text by Francis Fukuyama, which sketched his famous Thesis 26. The transformations that are currently being completed in the Eastern countries, this apparent evaporation of the communist regimes, would signify not simply the end of communism but essentially the end of history itself. These transformations would imply the coming to awareness by humanity that there is nothing beyond the present society. The present society is the industrial, capitalist, and commercial society that constitutes our modernity. 27. I am quoting here the summary offered by Jean-Claude Michéa for the Montpellier Colloquium. It served to introduce the debate about the end of history in which Cornelius Castoriadis, Edgar Morin, and Jean-Luc Boileau would participate. Jean-Claude Michéa began by recalling that for Fukuyama, to observe that we have entered into the end of history is to understand, whether one rejoices or is saddened by it, that, with the last illusions now dissipated and armed with this new knowledge, there is nothing left to be done except to manage what exists. 28. He then opened up the discussion of this thesis and formulated three questions. 1. First problem: as opposed to so-called traditional societies that aim, no matter the diversity of their forms, to maintain an equilibrium, modern society has as an ideal and principle the positing of its own development as carried onwards to the infinite. Yet, can this disenchantment of the world, this growing submission of life to laws of economics, continue infinitely without meeting limits in the resources of nature, on the one hand, and in the patience of individuals, on the other hand? 2. If this is not possible, and thus if, contrary to what Fukuyama thought, the critique and the surpassing of this world remains one of the practical necessities, does this mean, and this is the second problem, that the refreshing of Marxist critique, which remains the conscious or implicit foundation of the communist and socialist undertakings, would be enough to allow history to rediscover its genuine rhythm? Put differently, must we think that communism was not a digression in the century but simply a false start, i.e. that what was aberrant was not the essence of the project but only the historically determined forms of its implementation? Yet, doesn't suggesting this mean that one neglects to display what is fundamentally common, since Saint Simon, to the imaginaries of communism, socialism, and capitalism, i.e. the almost religious belief in the necessity and possibility of an infinite development of large-scale industry. 3. Finally, and this is the last problem, it is obvious that these questions assume a philosophy of history. Is it, as Hegel and Marx wanted, the site of a dialectical, logical, and necessary development? Do the rise of capitalism and the westernization of the world lie sleeping, in potentiality, in the Neolithic Revolution or in the practices of the indigenous peoples of the Amazonian forest? Or must we, on the contrary, with Rousseau for example, rehabilitate the role of the contingent, of the accidental, all of which makes history an unpredictable adventure that puts into play the freedom of men, which means their aptitude to invent something new. 29. Jean-Claude Michéa is very close to Mauss, and since he also passed through Marxism, we may observe that he is not happy just with the refreshing of Marxist critique or with rehabilitating a heterodox version of Marxism, since he refuses to blind himself to what is fundamentally common, since Saint Simon, to the imaginaries of communism, socialism, and capitalism, i.e. the almost religious belief in the necessity and in the possibility of an infinite development of large-scale industry. As for Castoriadis's contribution at Montpellier, I would like to quote the last sentences of it, since they lead us to the questions that will be debated at the meeting with Mauss, and they bear both on democracy and on the historical privilege of the societies in which it has appeared. All cultures have created magnificent works beyond the ensemblist identitary kind. 30. But as for what concerns human freedom, there have been only two cultures, like two great flowers pushing up on the bloody field of battle, in which something decisive was created, ancient Greece and Western Europe. This second flower is perhaps in process of withering away. Perhaps it depends on us for it not to wither away definitively. But in the end there is no guarantee that, if it withers away, a third flower might surge forth later, with more beautiful colors. 31. In the imaginary institution of society, Castoriadis had already written that the Athenians did not discover democracy amidst the other wild flowers growing on the PNYX. 32. Democracy is not given by nature nor by the dialectical development of social relations. It is a historical creation and, as such, it involves chance. Nothing is more foreign to Marxist thought. In Marx's thought, from On the Jewish Question to Capital and Critique of the Gotha Program, the foundational ideas of modern democracy are constantly reduced to the role of a juridical phraseology. 33. They constitute simply the formal conditions that make possible the generalization of commercial exchange. A commodity can only be sold and bought if its actual possessor, together with the acquirer to whom it will be transmitted, are free juridical subjects who dispose of one and the same jus utendi, fruendi, et abutendi with respect to the thing they are transmitting. 34. As long as the commercial sector remains enclosed in a feudal or Asiatic society, the formal equality and freedom of the economic actors have not yet been elevated into natural, eternal, and universal principles of the organization of society. But in modern capitalist society, wherein all the products of human labor and the labor itself become commodities, the juridical conditions for generalized exchange define the natural, imprescriptible, and inalienable rights of man. The democratic ideology is nothing other than the conscious expression, seemingly rational, of the historical necessity that completes itself in the social relations of production. Yet it conceals the historical and contingent character of capitalist society and gives it the appearance of a natural organization founded on human nature and on the natural laws of economics. According to the celebrated expression from The Poverty of Philosophy, there was history, but there is no more. 35. We should not underestimate the critical power of an argumentation that remains useful when one is faced with the ideological discourse of the liberal oligarchs, who continue to conceal the relations of exploitation and domination via the no-heat cloak of democratic values and the rule of law. This is, incidentally, the same approach that the young Castoriadis took, at the end of the 1940s, in rejecting the juridical fiction that, in the guise of Marxism, presented the USSR as a socialist state as soon as it had established the collective property of the means of production. For the same reasons that drove Marx to deny the fictional equality that established the bourgeois right between employer and employee, Castoriadis denied the fictional appropriation of the social riches by the working class, whose representation a single party had exclusively secured. Under different veils, the same exploitation was maintained as much in the East as in the West. It even reinforced itself in the way it deprived workers of the means for struggle, which they had been able to create through their previous struggles, unions, right to strike, workers' councils. It must be clarified, once again, that exploitation itself cannot be understood within the framework of a pretended economic science. 36. In any case, this reduction of democratic principles to the ideology of the bourgeois class misrecognized the reality of fundamental freedoms that have nothing to do with the freedom of commerce, such as the freedom to communicate one's opinions, a freedom that one cannot enjoy unless all others enjoy it. If the freedom of the egoist and utilitarian individual stops where the freedom of others begins, then the freedom of the citizen begins where the other's freedom begins. 37. On all of that, Castoriadis and Ma seem to be essentially in agreement. Yet, in the discussion Aloncale turns back against Cornelius Castoriadis the argument that he himself had brought against Marxism. If Marx was able to reduce universal history to a schema he drew from the recent history of Western capitalism, does Castoriadis, who presents democracy as a Greco-Western creation, escape from Hellenocentrism or Eurocentrism? Does he not misunderstand, contrary to the valuable observations of Pierre Clas Trace and, more unexpectedly, of Jean Beekler, the democratic character of ancient societies, which had the know-how to prevent the emergence of a separated power along with the schism of society into antagonistic social classes? This objection assumes that democracy would be defined only by procedures such as election or sortition, to which one has recourse, quite naturally, in the societies where the site of power remains undetermined or where it remains an empty site, as with the Greek agora, where each person could take up speech in turn. As Jean-Pierre Vernant shows, it is in these conditions that democracy was constituted in Greece, when what is in the center of the city and social life was no longer the palace of the king, as in Knossos, but the public place. 38. Are these conditions necessary and sufficient? If they are given, do they guarantee that democracy will bloom naturally, like a flower in spring? Recall that, among the Greeks, the most democratic institution, which was sortition, had at first been perceived as a means to allow the decision to be placed into the hands of the gods when men dared not decide for themselves. 39. But if, justifiably, we think the Greeks created democracy, it is because they took upon themselves the responsibility to give themselves laws that had been dictated to them neither by the gods, nor by destiny, nor even by nature. This is something one cannot find, of course, in primitive societies, which remain dominated by immemorial traditions. 40. Democracy thus cannot be reduced to the indeterminacy of the site where legitimate power, and the legitimacy of power, establishes itself. After all, such an indeterminacy defines merely the open society, in Karl Popper's sense, which means the liberal society. We certainly prefer it over fascism or Stalinism, but it is something completely different than democracy. In the debate with Mauss, Castoriadis refuses to define democracy by indeterminacy, a term he leaves to Claude Lefort, and recalls that, for his part, he speaks of creation. As soon as we speak of the radical imagination in individuals and of the radical instituting imaginary in history, which is what interests us here, we are obligated to admit that all societies alike proceed from a movement of the creation of institutions and significations. Now, as soon as we no longer limit ourselves to considering history, but instead when we give ourselves the right to have political positions, and this is already to depart not only from philosophical consideration but also from the simple assertion of a prima facie equivalence of all societies, then indeed this right is not something self-evident. 41. This is why, it must be said again, democracy is very much a historical creation of the Greco-Western world, which is not to say that it owns it like some good that must remain its own privilege. On the contrary, As soon as we adopt democratic values, i.e. those of a society in which, as Rousseau says, obedience to the law one has prescribed to oneself is freedom, then we posit them as universal values and we want them to rule over all society. 42 And yet, we cannot believe them to be natural, in the sense that the law of gravity is natural. And since they are not natural, it would be false to say that they are universal, if one understands by this that they are by nature, forever before and after. Rather, they become universal, they are created by the instituting imaginary. Men, anthropoi, homines, mens chen, human beings from both sexes, and not andres, viri, manner, men of the male sex, are not free and equal in rights, rather, we want them, him and her, to be so and hold to be inhumane the societies that treat them, him or her, as unequal, which is a judgment that applies to our societies. Through creating values, the Greco-Western man legislates for all men. But there is no question here of the imperial ethnocentrism by which one purported to impose civilization on barbarian peoples. First of all, this is because the Greeks, in the classical era, never believed that they were more civilized than the Persians and the Egyptians, whom they certainly called barbarians. But this word, which appeared in Herodotus, was so far from having a pejorative sense that Plutarch, long afterwards, went on to write an essay on the malice of Herodotus, whom he accused of being biased in favor of the barbarians. 43 It is only in the Roman era that the word barbarian, in being applied to people who lived beyond the limes of the Roman Empire, took on the meaning that, later, beginning in the 16th century, came to provide a pretext for the colonial expansion of the Western world. This is what the progressivist intelligentsia believes itself to be denouncing when it repeats, following Levi Strauss, that the barbarian is, first and foremost, the man who believes in barbarism. 44 But Levi Strauss himself, in a note added to the re-edition of Race and History, in his collection Structural Anthropology, Volume 2, recognized the logical incoherency of this shock phrase. 45 For in it the man who believes in barbarism is qualified as a barbarian by someone who claims one should not believe in barbarism. Montaigne knew how to avoid such an absurdity, in a text where he denounced European ethnocentrism, without falling into the trap of cultural relativism. In his essay on cannibals, he writes, I consider it more barbarous to eat a man alive than to eat him dead, to tear by rack and torture a body still full of feeling, to roast it by degrees, and then give it to be trampled and eaten by dogs and swine, than to roast and eat a man after he is dead. 46 Montaigne does not call into question the existence of barbarism. He is satisfied to observe that the conduct of the Europeans is still more barbarous than that of the cannibals, who are certainly barbarous, by reference to the laws of reason, but not in comparison with ourselves, who surpass them in every kind of barbarity. 47 This implies the reference to universal values, in the name of which a European can condemn the barbarism of his compatriots and render justice to colonized peoples. The word barbarism no longer has to qualify a people as such but rather a manner of acting, aggressive or cruel. These universal values are not to be confused with the values of our culture. They are universal only because they do not belong to us, and because every man in every other culture is entitled to make them his own. They are European or Greco-Western only to the extent, as Castoriadis explains in a text from 1983, that Europe no longer designates either a geographic entity or an ethnical entity. One of the strongest moments of the European creation is situated in New England at the end of the 18th century, and its effects have not ceased to be lively. And it i.e. Europe has not in fact been that way for 2 centuries. Japan, and the democracy wall dissidents in Beijing, and millions of people scattered across the planet belong to it. As for white South Africa, no. 48. Europe, in this sense, is the society that claims itself as autonomous and cannot want to impose autonomy on men or peoples who are satisfied with being heteronymous. People have no love for armed missionaries, and there is no question using arms to regulate disagreements with people who continue to say, adulterers must be stoned, thieves' hands must be cut off, and so on. 49. Autonomy, as Castoriadis declares in another text, propagates itself like a virus or a poison. It exerts a liberating contamination that can corrode the essentially religious significations that dominate, among other cultures, Islamic cultures. 50. The superiority of secular and democratic societies cannot be claimed unless it is as that of societies in which we can ask ourselves if our laws are just, or if we should change them, whereas such an interrogation has no meaning in a society in which it is imagined that the laws have been dictated by a god. Even so, this interrogation can disappear in a postmodern universe in which the divine laws pass over into natural laws, those of economics, of bioethics, or even those of a liberal credo that gives to the rights of man the transcultural status of an eternal truth and thereby hides the extraordinary historical creation that was their invention. To combat this collapse into heteronymous thought, Castoriadis remains more relevant than ever. To conclude, I would like to give my gratitude to Rafael Miranda, Jordi Torrent, and Juan Manuel Vera, who were at the origin of this work through the development of the project of a Spanish edition. 51. I revised the text of the debate for it, which was initially published in La Revue du Mas in its 2 distributions in 1999. Thanks also to Juvenal Quillet, the last but not least, who passed his recording on to me, which allowed me to complete the text and correct some errors. Debate with the Mas Group. Cornelius Castoriadis, et al. December 10, 1994, Paris, France. The Relativity of Relativism. Cornelius Castoriadis, I have a shortcoming in this discussion, which is that I followed your publications, but undoubtedly not with sufficient diligence or care. So you needn't be upset with me if at times I display a shameful lack of information about your positions. If ever I misrepresent them, though I don't believe I will do so, then it will be unintentionally. Alain Cale asked me how to prepare for this gathering. I told him that to avoid an introductory exposition, which is always too cumbersome, for the public in any case, it would be best to send me a number of questions, and that's what he did. There are 2 parts in the letter he sent me. The first is not really a question. He asks me to make an assessment of the Mas Group. Castoriadis reads the letter. It is in this spirit that we invited Claude Leffert, who, while rereading several texts in La Revue du Mas for the purpose of drafting a short paper to celebrate our 10th anniversary, suddenly felt himself to be at a great distance from some of our proposals, and notably from those of my friend Serge Latouche. Since, he said, it would require too much time and too many pages to explain the reasons for his disagreements, I invited him to come and express them for the completely informal Mas Group. 1. Perhaps you could take over from that initial debate, with which you were familiar, I believe. This would immediately open up questions we could ask you. There were some other questions that followed. I would like to say just a few things about this. I have a lot of sympathy for Mas. I have a lot of sympathy for what you do and for your critical spirit. But I would never dare to make an assessment of you. What does pose a slight problem for me are the limitations that you would trace out, or that you do trace out, for the idea or for the significance of the gift as the means, but also perhaps as the end goal, of an institution of society. 2. After all, at the same time, the majority of you, in any case Cale, in what follows in his letter, seem to defend very fervently the idea of the market. We'll return to this in the discussion. There's something not entirely consistent there, I think. Or else one would need to try to specify what the spheres of the market are and what the spheres of the gift are, and then perhaps we must try, but I would prefer to do this later, to deepen and criticize a bit this idea of the gift. I will say a few things about this momentarily. I read the paper Leffert sent you, you ask me to say what I think of it. 3. I don't have a lot to say about it in fact. To speak entirely frankly, as is my habit and my nature, I think in Leffert's work there's a defense of democracy in general, or a theory of democracy, if you will. I will say some things momentarily about my own position. But what I do not see in Leffert's work, despite the note on the bottom of the page that you added to his text, is any kind of critique of contemporary society. 4. And I'm at once both very resolute about that issue and very unpleasantly surprised. There are sentences like, "Don't think that I'm an unconditional partisan in favor of modernity or contemporary society." 5. I don't know who is an unconditional partisan of it. Ballader himself undoubtedly isn't, since he says, "Change is necessary." 6. But what does that mean? What do we hold against contemporary society? As soon as we lay it out precisely in light of its implications, even if it's only in light of the genuine idea of democracy in its full potentiality, we see that there are things that don't line up. And this critique extends well beyond the traditional Marxist or similar critiques. There are new phenomena that are more than unsettling. There's a kind of collapse, we could call it an implosion, like a building whose foundation is giving way, of contemporary Western humanity. It's imploding, and it's starting to lean like the Tower of Pisa, but perhaps without the same resilience. Alon Kale, perhaps it's going faster. See Castoriadis, yes, perhaps it's going faster. But that's not all. It's not with an eye to pragmatic considerations that we're critiquing the contemporary situation. That's a small aspect of the question and not all that important. We're critiquing it for principled reasons, which means this: what do we make of this society in which the main thing that concerns people is, for those who are able at least, getting rich and, for everyone else, surviving and wasting away? There's a real problem there. The discourse on democracy as indeterminacy is fine, or not fine, I don't know, but it's not my cup of tea. 7. In the end, there's a fundamental contemporary situation that we cannot accept as is. I will turn now to the questions. I don't know if there are any comments on that, or things we can talk about now. Jacques Douid, you can warm us up a bit more. See Castoriadis, I will go on then, and I will raise the temperature a little bit by reading Kale's letter. On the other hand, and I am speaking here in my own name, I must tell you that while I have always had sympathy for what you write and for the clarity, and so on, I am left a bit unsatisfied on the following points. First point, I do not comprehend well how you reconcile your affirmation that all cultures are equal with the claim that one among them is more equal than the others, i.e. the culture of Greek society. 8. Supplementary question, to what extent is modern Western culture its legitimate heir? And would it also be entitled to be more equal than the others? This links us directly back to the first debate on the Heideggerian leftist third-worldism of my friend Serge Latouche. Laughter. With that, I think the temperature is already starting to rise. Laughter. But it's also rising for another reason. I'm a bit offended. Firstly, the reason is, given that these accusations of Hellenocentrism are still there, that I do not speak of Greek society exclusively. I talk about the movement of autonomy within the segment of universal history that is the Greco-Western segment. This isn't only about Greece, it's doubtless also about Western Europe, starting at a certain moment, probably in the 11th or 12th century. Second, I have always gone to great lengths to affirm that I don't consider Greek culture, or for that matter Western culture, even in its better features, to be a model for the rest of humanity or for ourselves in the future. I am simply saying that something does begin there. There's the germ of something. 9. What is this germ? Quite simply, to put it in its simplest expression, it's the calling into question of oneself. And that's what we're going to do, what we are already in the process of doing today. Kale's question, are you not Eurocentric, is a Eurocentric question. It's a question that's possible in Europe. I don't see anyone in Tehran asking the Ayatollah Khomeini if he's Iranocentric or Islamocentric. Because that goes without saying. This critique of oneself begins in Greece. It's Herodotus saying that the Persians are infinitely better than the Greeks and that the Egyptians are wiser. 10. It gets taken up again in the West starting in at least the 16th century with Las Casas, Montaigne, then Swift, and then Montesquieu. I am thinking of the Persian letters, and then the Enlightenment. This contestation, this calling into question of oneself, is for me what's essential in the contribution of ancient Greece beforehand, and in the West afterwards. This is what allows, for example, for there to be a political movement, i.e. one of true politics and not of the political, as is said today by a fashion that to me seems stupid. 11. The political and politics. See Castoriadis, the political is what has to do with power in a society. 12. As for power in a society, it has always been there and always will be there, i.e. power in the sense of decisions concerning the collectivity that take on an obligatory character and the non-respect of which is in some way punished, even if it's simply the thou shalt not kill. That's unless we're supposed to believe in the bad anarcho-Marxist utopia that one day individuals will act spontaneously in a social way, that there will be no need for constraint or the like, and that there won't even be a need to undertake collective decisions. Marx talks, for example, about the rational planning of men's exchanges between themselves and with nature. 13. Yet, who carries out this rational planning? It's men. Are they all in agreement miraculously? No. There's a minority, perhaps, or several. Must they follow the majority or not? Or does each fall back into a part of the continent and apply his own proper plan? But what could all that mean? Therefore, there will be decisions of a collective order. These decisions will impose on everyone. Which is not to say that there will have to be a state, but that there will have to be a power. But this power has always existed, as much here as there, for example in the primitive tribe, in Claster's tribe, on the plateaus of Upper Burma, in China. 14. Confucius grapples with it. What is he addressing? The discussion of the better ways to manage an existing power. These are counsels addressed to those who govern, saying that the good emperor is the one we talk about as little as possible, as we read in the Tao Te Ching. 15. This is the political. But this is not what concerns us. On the other hand, the part played by the Greek world and the Western world is politics. This is politics as collective activity that aims to be lucid and conscious, and that puts into question the existing institutions of society. Maybe it does so in order to reconfirm them, but it puts them into question. By contrast, in the framework of the Pharaonic Empire, the empire of the Maya or Inca, the Aztec or Chinese, or in Babur's empire in the Indies, there may be a question of knowing whether or not one should carry out such and such a war, whether or not one should raise taxes, or peasants work duties, or the like, but there's no question of calling into doubt the existing institution of society. 16. So, there you have what constitutes the privilege of, say, Western culture, and let's no longer say Greek culture. And that's what concerns us today. It puts itself into question and it recognizes itself as one culture among others. And, therein, we in effect have a paradoxical situation, we say all cultures are equal. But it must be observed, as a first approximation or a first step, if you will, that among all these cultures only one recognizes this equality of cultures. The others do not recognize it. This is a problem that raises theoretical political problems and may come to raise practical questions. As it happens, the present situation is entirely disastrous, and for the moment we perceive no opening. 10 or 15 years ago, Colonel Gaddafi, he was called crazy, and maybe that's so, declared that the catastrophic deviation in universal history took place when Charles Martel stopped the Arab expansion at Poitiers and that what should be done now is to Islamize Europe. If we want to be Islamized, that's fine. Otherwise, what's to be done? And not only that. There's constant talk now about the right to intervene. In yesterday's Le Monde there was a protest emanating from an Italian Christian mission in Sudan. The local Islamist government, after having beaten, tortured, and crucified them, had executed 4 Christians, perhaps it was the heads of the tribe. 17. I don't know if it's necessary to enact the right to intervene. In any case it's not going to happen. But is it the case that, since cultures are equal, we have to give up denouncing these acts, all while we would not and do not give up denouncing the death penalty in the United States, for example? There you have it. There, we have all at once an intellectual problem, if I may say so, and a paradox. But we have to confront these things. And there's also a practical problem that we're spared from at the moment, but maybe we won't always be. Its consequences risk being very significant. A subsidiary question arises on this point. To what extent is modern Western culture the legitimate inheritor of Greek culture, and would it also have the right to be more equal than the others? I have already responded to this in part. I think that right now, even within the state of disrepair or collapse, nevertheless Western culture is more or less the only one within which one can exercise a contestation and a calling into question of the existing institutions. Doing so does not immediately get you marked, I would say, as an accomplice of Satan, a heretic, a traitor to the tribe, to society, and the like. To what extent is this culture the legitimate inheritor of Greek culture? Perhaps the question doesn't have an enormous interest in today's discussion, and moreover the response can't be simple. In one sense, there are very important parts of Greek culture that have been abandoned, and we may regret that. Regarding other parts, we can do nothing but rejoice at their absence, as with slavery, for example, or the status of women. With respect to the problem of secularization among the Greeks, and even though in the modern world this question is not settled, the fact is that they had a very bizarre attitude toward religion. It was in effect a civic religion, an appendage of the state, and not the reverse. And then, for all that, there's an intellectual opening in our times that's even greater than in Greece. But, in the end, this is not really a question with an immediate practical interest, even if it is of very great philosophical interest, and even if we'd be right to say that there is, specifically in the history of philosophical thought, a tangential path that gets taken, I would call it a derailing, with respect to the earliest Greek thought. But this tangential path and this derailing are already there in Plato. It's what becomes thereafter, to put it succinctly, a sort of rationalism or the like, which manifests itself as much at the philosophical, intellectual level as at the practical level. But, in the end, for it to manifest itself, other elements also had to intervene that were not there even in Plato. 18. It's really a very particular question. Anyway, I will stop here for this point. A. Kale, thank you. I believe there are already lots of questions. Perhaps we have a first debate to initiate on this? Silence. Since no one is jumping in, I would like to respond, since I'm still left wanting for more and still perplexed. Basically, it seems to me that you are defending, on the one hand, a position that I would call hyper-relativist, even if you didn't do so right now, by affirming that societies proceed, one and all, from the same arbitrariness, i.e. from the radical instituting imaginary. 19. And from this perspective, it's impossible to order them hierarchically. Therefore, they are all valuable. And, on the other hand, you are on the side of what seems to me to be a very radical universalism. After all, you affirm in a nearly unconditional way, and it's here that I would like to question you, the value of one cultural dimension among all the others, beyond all the others, namely that of self-questioning. And from this perspective of affirming this unconditional value of self-questioning, which is furthermore, to go back to the very start of your exposition, the unconditional value of accepting the radical indeterminacy of the social relation, you, accepting this unconditional value, say, this value could only be realized in a society, in a certain period of history, in the case of Greek society, in a moment of the history of Western Europe, 11th-12th century. See Castoriadis. Starting in A. Kale. Starting in the 11th-12th century, exactly. And this is found nowhere else. The fact of this historical singularity must be accounted for. This is what raises the question for me in two ways. There is, on the one hand, a question of fact that we could discuss. I think you are right about the acceptance of collective indeterminacy. One could find, I believe, even elsewhere than in the West, traces of the acceptance of the indeterminacy of the individual subject, those of Buddhism, of Taoism, and so on, but with regard to things at the strictly political level, I think you are right. Yet the question that I'm posing for you is perhaps not so much the question of fact, which we could discuss more, but the question of right. Do what you will, I do not see how you are able not to valorize, not to accord an eminent value to this self-questioning, to the acceptance of this indeterminacy. And as soon as you accept this, which, by the way, seems legitimate to me in many respects, necessarily you must valorize and consider as more equal than the others, as superior to the others, the only society in history that places at its core the acceptance of indeterminacy. And all of your reasonings go in this direction, for that matter, since, as you said a bit ago, you show that in all the other societies, all the societies other than European society, horrendous practices unfold. You talk of slavery and the situation of women. This goes so far that, departing from the acceptance of all the cultural values of all societies, you end up in fact with the condemnation of all the values of all societies, except those of Western society. Indeterminacy and creation. See Castoriadis, first of all, a remark on the word indeterminacy. 20. This term is not in any way my own. I reject it. I speak of creation. 21. And creation is not simply indeterminacy. With respect to indeterminacy, there is perhaps such a thing in the quantum world, I know nothing about that, and there is undoubtedly an indeterminacy in every human world. But what democracy accepts is not simply indeterminacy but also many other things. It accepts, it affirms freedom. It affirms the right of the majority and at a minimum the equality of opinions, without which the right of the majority makes no sense. After all, if Plato were right, if there were some people who know and others who don't know, then we would not take the people into account. And more generally, at the ontological level, what defines being is not indeterminacy, it is the creation of new determinations. And if there ever is a society that accords with my wishes, it will not be a society of indeterminacy. It will be a society that determines itself in another way, precisely in a way that allows for the calling of itself into question and so on. But this is a creation, it is a law of that society. To speak of indeterminacy is in my view to say nothing meaningful. We should speak of a creative imaginary, one that is instituting, which means determining. Here, we're talking philosophy. So, in this respect, from the philosophical point of view, I had to speak a moment ago of a paradox that perhaps essentially boils down to the passage from philosophy to politics. As soon as we speak of the radical imagination in individuals and of the radical instituting imaginary in history, which is what interests us here, we are obligated to admit that all societies alike proceed from a movement of the creation of institutions and significations. 22. There are the creations of the Maya and the Aztec, those of the Egyptians, of the Greeks, those of the 13th and 14th century Italians, and so on, and ours today, and those of the Chinese, no matter which ones. So, at the philosophical level I want to reject historical determinisms and to reject equally, for example, a philosophy of history of the Hegelian type, with its hierarchy of societies that progress by always realizing more of reason until there is a society that completes its reign. There's that, on the one hand. Now, as soon as we no longer limit ourselves to considering history, that is, to theorein, to doing theory, i.e. theory in the profound, strong sense of the term, to watching the unfolding of human history, to trying to understand it, to trying to understand different societies, but instead when we give ourselves the right to have political positions, and this is already to depart not only from philosophical consideration but also from the simple assertion of a prima facie equivalence of all societies, then indeed this right is not something self-evident. 23. For my part, what surprises me very often in these discussions, and I am not directing this at you, is our provincialism. We speak as if people have always taken political positions, have always gotten the right to discuss and to criticize their society. But that is a total illusion, the provincialism of a hyper-cultivated milieu. These things only existed for 2 centuries in antiquity and for 3 centuries in modern times. And even then they didn't exist everywhere, only on tiny promontories, on the Greek promontory or the Western European promontory. That's it. Elsewhere, they didn't exist. A traditional Indian or Chinese person doesn't consider the act of taking political positions, of judging his society, to be something self-evident. On the contrary, this seems inconceivable to him, he doesn't have the mindset to do it. So, as soon as we give ourselves this right, we find ourselves also with the obligation to say, among these different types of societies, what do we choose? Islamic society? The Roman Empire under the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, i.e. the Golden Age, at least for those who were effectively rolling in the gold? Should we reinstate the empire of the Nerva-Antonines? Why not? Well, no. But why? In the name of what? Precisely because, and this is again a paradox, the culture in which we find ourselves gives us the armament and the means to have a critical posture. By means of it we make a choice from among, say, present historical paradigms, or from among possible projects rather than paradigms since, as I said earlier, there is no model. There is a project of autonomy, which has its germ in Greece and in the West, but which undoubtedly must also extend much further. At that moment, we are positing ourselves as political men, i.e. beings or anthropoi, not males, and we are saying, look, we are for, e.g. for the rights of man, equality between men and women, and we are against, e.g. against vaginal infibulation and genital mutilation. We are against it? I am against it? So, I don't see where the contradiction is. I have never said that from the perspective of a political choice all cultures are equivalent, for example, that the slave culture of the Southern American states, depicted so idyllically by Margaret Mitchell in Gone with the Wind, is as valuable as whatever other culture, from a political point of view. That simply is not true. I don't know if my response satisfies you. See Mouth, with respect to what you just said, the conditions for the universalization of these values, of self-critique, of democracy, that you defend, what would they be? Because I believe they can't become widespread unless a series of cultural conditions are given. Thus, how do you see these values of Western origin becoming the dominant values in other cultures? What would your position be with respect to that? See Castoriadis, this is a practical question. See Mouth, practical and theoretical at once. The condition for the universalization of Western values. See Castoriadis, at the theoretical level, the response would not be very difficult, since we can simply talk about Tiananmen in Beijing. Contrary to what certain people have said, or would wish, democracy does not make up part of the Chinese tradition. That's not true. There were movements, there was Taoism and other things, but that is not what we call democracy. The Chinese, some at least, go demonstrate at Tiananmen. One of them is there, in front of the tanks. He gets himself crushed advocating for democracy. What does that mean? It means there is really an appeal in these values, as there was in the countries of Eastern Europe, even though things are quite bastardized there, it's sad but true, after the collapse of communism. What I mean is that, as soon as these values are realized somewhere, if only in a very insufficient and very deformed way as they have been and still are in the West, they exercise a sort of appeal over others, without there being, for that matter, a fate or a universal calling of people for democracy. But if what you have asked me is, what do we do if the others persist? Since this is, after all, the question, then the response is, we can do nothing except preach by example. Robespierre said, people don't love armed missionaries. 24 As for me, I'm not for imposing by force some democracy, some revolution in the Islamic countries or in others. I'm for the defense of these values, for their propagation by example. And I believe, but this is another question, that if at present this, let's say, radiance has lost much of its intensity, things are indeed more complicated than that. It's in large part due to the sort of internal collapse of the West. The rebirth of fundamentalisms on Islamic soil or elsewhere, after all, in India there are analogous phenomena among Hindus, is in large part due to what one must well and truly call the spiritual failure of the West. Today, Western culture is showing itself, alas, more and more for what it is, a culture of gadgets. What then do the other cultures do? With an admirable duplicity, they take the gadgets and they leave out the rest. 25 They take the jeeps, the submachine guns, the television as a means for manipulation, at least the wealthy classes do, who have the color televisions, cars, and the like, but they say everything else is Western corruption, the great Satan, and so on. I believe it's all due to, and is also conditioned by, the fact that the West itself has a less and less powerful radiance because, precisely, Western culture, and this is insofar as it's a democratic culture in the strong sense of the term, is weakening itself more and more. Yet, let's return to your question about the condition for the universalization of these values. The condition is that others self-appropriate them. And there's an addendum here, which is entirely essential in my mind, specifically that to self-appropriate them does not mean to Europeanize. This is a problem I'm not in a position to resolve. If it is resolved, it will be through history. I have always thought there needs to be, not some possible synthesis, I don't like this word, it's too radical socialist, but a common transitioning that would combine the democratic culture of the West, along with the steps that must be or should be to come, i.e. a true individual and collective autonomy in society, with another mode of conservation, recovery, and development of the values of sociality, which endure, to the extent that they have endured, in the countries of the Third World. After all, there still are, for example, tribal values in Africa. Unfortunately, they manifest themselves more and more in mutual massacres. But they also continue to manifest themselves in forms of solidarity between persons. Such forms are practically wholly lost in the West and are miserably replaced by the social security system. Therefore, I'm not saying it's necessary to transform Africans, Asians, or others into Europeans. I'm saying it's necessary for there to be something that would advance onwards, and in the Third World, or at least in certain parts of it, there are still some comportments, anthropological types, social values, or imaginary significations, as I call them. They could likewise get caught up in this movement, transform it, enhance it, and make it bear fruit. Serge Latouche, I would like to jump back and return to Alain Kale's question, in the end, since Alain in fact took up mine, in a certain sense. I find that your position is, at any rate, a bit radical concerning this stepping back, or this capacity for a critique of self, in other societies. After all, the examples that you are using, you take them from contemporary reality, which means from societies that are westernized and poorly westernized. These are modernized societies, which means ones in which we witness, owing to their contradictions, what one could call a totalitarian closure of the mind. There nevertheless were in ancient societies, in the great societies, in China or in India some important periods of philosophical discussion with universalist dimensions and cases of stepping back. Now, I understand well that this critique of self, this stepping back in relation to self, never attained the level it attained in the West. That's clear. But this point has its reverse side. Certainly, the West pushed farthest the idea of a universal humanity, through opposition to specific existing cases of tribal self-enclosure, which, by the way, were never a total self-enclosure. Certainly, the idea of a potentially fraternal humanity of equal or identical men and so on was never developed as far as in the West. But how did it develop, and how was it constructed? In a very particular way. What made men into a collection, a solidary ensemble, is precisely the fact that we defined a common enemy of this humanity, which other societies did not do. 26 And this enemy is nature. As soon as we decided that man was master and possessor of nature, we designated the victim, which gave solidarity to humans among themselves. 27 This victim was nature, the secrets of which it was necessary to mine and which, as Bacon said, one had to submit to our desires like a public woman in order to draw out from it materially the condition for a universal fraternity. 28 This condition was the enrichment of everyone, which would thus allow for eliminating the conflicts between men, transferring them into conflicts between men and nature. Therein lies, potentially, this contradiction whereby through instrumentalizing nature, which previous societies or other societies had never done to this extent, we gave ourselves the means to instrumentalize man per se. If, within the same movement, we proclaimed a universalist fraternity, we also destroyed it through deciding that certain men were not men, or were sub-men. They were transitioned over, qua slaves, to the side of nature. And thus, we could just as well subjugate them and treat them according to our desires. All of a sudden we perhaps abolished slavery, but we invented the concentration camps. See Castoriadis. I have no problem with, so to speak, softening to an extent the edges of an opposition I present as sharp, given that I want to highlight something. I want to shake people up. I want to make it understood that man is not, by divine right, a democratic being, that democracy was a creation and a conquest of history, that it's constantly in danger, and that furthermore it's in process of going away. In Europe we had totalitarianism and we have, after totalitarianism, the power of the corrupt media, politicians, and big businessmen. But, first of all historically, it's no doubt necessary to step back and examine more closely the case of India and of China. It's not only that self-questioning was pushed much less far along at the intellectual level. The 2 points are indeed entirely conjoined. It's also that this philosophical culture remained a culture of the mandarins, in the broader sense of the term. It doesn't take place in the agora. 29 It takes place in a closed milieu, which is the milieu of well-read people, the sages, the philosophers, and the like. This is true as much in India as in China. And, tied in with this, and this is obvious to me, you never see in India nor in China this combination of restlessness and the movement of philosophical interrogation with the political question. Take the greatest sages. You see them saying, the Emperor X should do this or that. In other words, it's a matter of the reasonable management of the instituted power. For example, never does a radical utopia emerge, even though one may criticize the idea of a radical utopia, from the pen of a philosopher, one concerned with the state of the city, of the society. That's the first point. Otherwise, I'm entirely in agreement with you in accepting the idea that in Buddhism, or indeed in Taoism, there is a calling into question that goes pretty far, to the level, once again, of representation, of the representations of the tribe. Now, when you say that in the West universality was gained at the expense of an enemy that is nature, and that the instrumentalization of nature transformed itself into an instrumentalization of humans, I would say, yes and no. Why? I'm entirely in agreement with you in saying that a new attitude with respect to nature appeared in the West and, contrary to Heidegger by the way, I don't think it's the result of Western metaphysics. I think that the journey taken by Western metaphysics is, starting at a certain point, correlative to, without in any way being the result of or the reflection of, the journey taken by all of society. There's an imaginary of rational mastery that appeared in the West, indeed before Descartes and even before Bacon, with the Swiss watchmakers at the end of the Middle Ages, when a precise measure of time was needed. 30 And this factor isn't necessarily tied to the others, it doesn't, in itself, constitute progress of the productive forces. It's also a will to lay down order. There's Bacon. There's Descartes, masters and possessors of nature. There's Leibniz, while God calculates, the world emerges, and so on. 31 There's this whole movement and also, of course, the idea that one can and must exploit to the maximum a nature that's there as a simple object of exploitation. You doubtless know that I'm entirely opposed, including politically, to that attitude. But I would say that it's not necessarily bound up with what I call the Greco-Western movement towards autonomy. For example, that attitude is in no way characteristic of the ancient Greeks, absolutely not. There, the connection with nature is completely otherwise, the trees are inhabited by the dryads, the rivers are gods, and so forth. Here, we are dealing with the question of the relation between the movement towards autonomy and capitalism. There's in effect something very important, very strange, that unfolds in the West starting in the 14th to 17th centuries. This is the coexistence of two nuclear imaginary significations. On the one hand, there's the movement towards autonomy. On the other hand, there's capitalism, briefly put. They seem more or less to join up around the idea of rationality. This is a historical misunderstanding, if I may say so, if the term historical misunderstanding has a meaning, and if one can accuse history of generating misunderstandings. But, said Baudelaire, the world only goes round by misunderstanding. 32 And this misunderstanding likewise manifests itself in the 17th to 19th centuries in, for example, the adoption of a certain number of ideas, of orientations, that are squarely capitalist by the workers' movement and particularly by Marx, among others. Marx is non-synonymous with the workers' movement, of course. One last point about this, I also do not think that the instrumentalization of nature is what drives towards the instrumentalization of humans. I think the two proceed from something else, namely from the idea, the imaginary signification, of an unlimited expansion of rational mastery. The instrumentalization of humans, in the form of slavery for example, can be found independently of capitalism, independently of ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was not exceptional in having slavery. All ancient societies were familiar with it, including the African societies, as we know very well. Thus, it's something else, I think. What must be said is that in previous societies the exploitation of nature, like that of humans, emerged, if I may say so, in a naive way. That is, one would chain someone up and make him work, for example. And in capitalism the one and the other, the exploitation of nature and the exploitation of humans, are done with chronometer in hand. You must do so many acts in 1 hour of work and so forth. I don't know if you're satisfied with my response. Jacques Douet, I have 2 questions to pose, but I'll reserve the second one for later because it is more general. The first, a remark, came to me while listening to you there when you said that, at bottom, this is not about Europeanizing. Thus, you supported the idea that it would be desirable, ideally of course, to maintain certain tribal values, for example the idea, the practice, of a solidarity. Now, while listening to you, I'm saying to myself, but doesn't all this bring us back to ourselves? Isn't it also valid for ourselves? In the end, wouldn't there be a danger in thinking of ourselves, in comprehending ourselves purely, essentially, as self-questioning beings, i.e. beings who put themselves into question by themselves, but forget that there is something else in our identity, in what we are, in our tradition, and that there are also values of solidarity. I believe we call that, here in the Moss Group, primary sociality. 33 Thus, it seemed to me that this brings us back to ourselves. A. Kale, may I add a little compliment to Jacques Douet's question? You're calling for the combination of the values of self-interrogation with those of solidarity, i.e. of a general sociality, which is more alive elsewhere than here. But the formidable question is really that of knowing to what extent these values of solidarity are partly bound, if not to the repression of, then at least to the shutting out of the values of self-questioning. See Castoriadis, since, with Leffert, you're talking above all about Tocqueville, I will send you back to Tocqueville. 34 For him, under the Ancien regime, there was this social chain going from the most poor of the peasants, and actually from the serfs, up to the monarch. There were solidarities. The noble was not only or not essentially the horrible exploiter, dominator, and so on. He was also the one who took care of his men and everything else. The village had solidarity. For Tocqueville, all of that got dissolved, or tended more or less to get dissolved, in the movement towards the equality of conditions. That's entirely true. But the question is, what do we do now? In the West, these values were lost or are on their way to being lost. Short of making a long parenthetical aside or telling my life story, on a Greek island where I always go to pass the summer, every year I can see it as if on a thermometer, the growing dislocation of the villager community, which was still very alive 15 years ago. 15 years ago, every year, a family was responsible for the village festival and prepared the great collective Christmas feast that happened beside the church. Through all of that and through a whole series of other things, the village was alive. I did a quick calculation. It was, how to say this? Living off 97% self-production and self-consumption. It imported iron and silk, that's all. All the rest was produced, built, cultivated, woven, recycled, or the like in the village. And all of that is in process of breaking down, if only because there's no more village. The people are not leaving for Germany or Australia but for Athens. What can be done there? If there's a striking thing in politics, it's in noticing, when we are not being superficial, and I hope not to be, that the citizen is not, must not be, and cannot be, if he's a true citizen, a disincarnate being. A political consciousness is not what puts itself into question, what calls into question what surrounds it. A human being does that, i.e. one who belongs to a community and so on. And this community has values that are neither philosophical nor political as such. They are partly aristocratic values but above all the values of human life, like those we are alluding to here. And these values can't even be formulated, even less so imposed, in and through a political program. What can we say about this? When I first came to Paris, Bastille Day was already there, and I danced every night in my neighborhood, at Rue Falguière, at Metro Stop Pasteur. 35 every bistro put on its own ball. Each had its little band, the accordionist, and everyone from the neighborhood. Bastille Day would come and we started on the afternoon of the 13th and wrapped up on the 14th, late at night, eating sandwiches, dancing, above all to the Bal Musette style but also at a certain point to the rumba, the samba, and the like. And since the 60s that no longer exists. Paris no longer exists. There were neighborhoods. There aren't any more. What do we do now? Do we inscribe into a political program the reconstruction of the neighborhoods of Paris as urban villages with Bastille Day, the corner grocer, and everything else? I'm absolutely sorry for the evolution of Paris. But what's at stake is an authentic, informal creation of society which is now ruined. One may have hope for it, i.e. that it will restart, and doubtless it will restart in other forms. But we can't lay it out in a political discussion unless it's just to note that, effectively, there's a problem there. Do it, so, this is the acknowledgement of the limits of our power to act? See Castoriadis, absolutely. We are not the society. We are a constituent of it in a prospective social movement. And we can thus also say, like Kale, that there are values of solidarity that are very important. But we cannot make it into one of the points of a political program. Latouche, just before, I didn't immediately react to your response. But I care to return to it. It doesn't satisfy me fully because you dissociate the three elements that for me constitute a sort of whole in my analysis, namely rational mastery, the domination of nature, and humanism. First of all, I think that these three elements are already there in germ form in the Greeks. There's no radical break in the history of the West between antiquity and the Renaissance. And, furthermore, we don't find those elements anywhere else. When you say there were slaves not only in the West, that's true. But the category of slave gathers extremely different things, extremely different attitudes. A domestic captive in Africa counts as a slave, since they could make him into a slave through the slave trade, but that's not the same as a thing. He counts neither as an instrument nor a thing. He doesn't count entirely as a man, since when they're not a member of the tribe, they're not completely counted a man. But the animals aren't men either, and, for all that, they aren't things. They too make up a part of the universe, of the cosmos, and so forth. So, this is entirely different. Yet, precisely, it seems to me that this attitude is already changing in ancient Greece. You mentioned the Dryads, but I don't think Aristotle believes much in the Dryads, and in his era. There are texts of Aristotle. Obviously you are a lot more competent than me on this, my mastery of Greek is very limited. There's a text where he says, if my memory is correct, that there's no place in the city for horses, for other animals, for things, and so on. He says there's no philia possible between man and horse. 36 There's indeed a rather radical exclusion of nature, which didn't exist in an African animist society. And, in effect, Greek and Latin law thus already go on from there to define the slave as an instrumentum vocale and thus make possible an instrumentalization. So, there's already a beginning there. And it's not by chance if at the same time in Stoicism the humanist ideology appears, i.e. the idea that there exists a common interest of humanity. And what is the common interest of a humanity divided into tribes, into religions, into nations, or the like, unless it's that all men have in common an interest in becoming dominant over aids, in mining into the secrets of nature, in mastering the universe, and so on. As soon as this idea of a common interest takes shape, of a humanity against nature, this category of humanity can appear. It thus appears with this Western universalism, let's admit that. But it appears with these two components, which, in my view, we cannot dissociate. See Castoriadis. Perhaps we shouldn't prolong this discussion since, here, we're entering into a terrain that's very complex, very difficult, and very slippery, specifically that of the relation between real history and the evolution of ideas. And, personally, I'm quite opposed to the idea of reducing real evolutions to ideas or of making them correspond to them, i.e. this species of inverted Marxism, which is Heidegger's little indulgence by the way. It holds that Western technocracy is the completion of Western metaphysics, and so forth. Well, that's not true. Thomas Aquinas is a grand metaphysician, but he has nothing to do with rational mastery and the world of technology. I don't agree with your historical analysis. I believe that an entirely particular turn is taken by the West starting at a certain moment. I don't think the situation is the same in antiquity. Slaves can be freed, and a lot more in Rome, as you know, than in Athens. In late antiquity there were even emperors, in the 3rd century, who decreed collective emancipations. In the history of slavery, Aristotle is a particular case. To my knowledge, and no one has changed my mind yet on this topic of discussion, Aristotle is truly the first Greek who justifies slavery. 37 Plato doesn't justify it, nor does anyone else. And Aristotle does it with restrictions, for that matter, since when he speaks of slaves by nature, he offers a definition that one could almost accept. He says that these are people who are not able to self-direct themselves. But we put the people who are not able to self-direct themselves into the psychiatric hospital. And we mustn't forget that the Greeks became Greek. They learned to read and write with Homer, they chanted Homer at the festivals. Yet, in Homer there are characters of whom one knows in advance that they're going to become slaves. And who are they? They're the noblest characters in the epic. It's Andromache, for example. And you can see in Thucydides, in the discussion of the Athenians and the Melians, that there's no attempt to make a rational justification there. 38 The Athenians say, this is a law we didn't invent, we found it there, and it is valid among humans and among gods. The law is the right of the strongest. It's Aristotle who had the idea, as a philosopher, to rationalize the state of things and to say, no, It's not just Andromache, there are lots of people who are slaves by accident and shouldn't be so. 39 So, I think this is something that changes with modern capitalism. It changes even regarding the relationship to slaves, insofar as they continue to exist in the Western Hemisphere at the start of the 19th century. They exist in the slavery, quasi-slavery, of the industrial proletariat, in what we rightly called the reification of work, which is something quite different than before. And the idea of humanity does not go along with the idea of rational mastery. Here, we are getting into extremely complicated discussions. For example, the idea of humanity is that of the Stoics, of course, who nevertheless drew from it no practical conclusion, as you know, since for them there is no question of political action. But that's also the Christian idea. That's St. Paul, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman. 40 This idea, as an idea, is there for 15 centuries, as a reality, it is not Christianity. Contrary to what the clerics say, Christianity never raised a finger to abolish slavery. And when Las Casas defended the Native Americans by saying, no, they have a soul, it was in order to say at the same time, no, the Africans have no soul, so you can subjugate them and transport them to the Americas. 41 I think that of course these ideas play a role in history, but they are the expressions, the results. They can become the motors anew when they are taken up into historical evolution. For example, the Western Europeans are somehow Christianized during a very long period, but it's only in the 14th century that the peasants rise up in England and start singing, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman. 42 This idea had been there since the year 60 after Jesus Christ. No serf, no slave used it yet. But when the historical situation changed, when society started to protest, it took up Christianity and made something else out of it. And this Christianity that preaches equality down here on earth is not a true one. Christianity preaches equality up there on high. My response is a bit diffuse, but I believe the question itself is diffuse. Not your question, the question, Diefridge, the problem. A. Kale, one final question, perhaps, on this point? Louis Basley. 43. Louis Basley, these are above all remarks, it's neither agreement nor disagreement. But the Hebrew question is never broached, and monotheism seems a very important element in the idea of humanity, just as in, I would say, the Judeo- or Hebraico-Greek convergence. You cited St. Paul. There are some things there, some rather interesting points of bifurcation that can sleep for centuries. That's a first point. Here's another one. I think that, despite yourself, you're not as far from Leffert as you say, and that at the same time you two are in radical opposition. As soon as you talk about the possibility for contestation, you have indeterminacy, there's nothing to be done about that. And when you move from a world of aristocratic warriors to a mass democracy, well then you automatically have decadence, privatization, abdication, all of which Tocqueville rightly analyzed. You get the fact that, instead of forming a community, one forms a society, as Beekler says in his latest book. 44 At that moment, the political will subsides, quite obviously, and the scene gets occupied, we might say, by communities of interests. All that is well understood, it's what you were talking about just a while back. So, at that point, it seems to me that this pertains more to a positive sociological description. In other words, there are social mechanisms that will get set into place automatically and a certain number of referents, of principles, of calibrations are there, I would say. And, at that point, this means, it's not because you have a radical, self-critical imaginary and so forth that you've thus forgotten about the forces of power, the forces of the social, or the like. They're treated differently in your society, in particular the invisible and all such things that get talked about very little. The fact of emancipating oneself from the invisible goes back to Tocqueville's and to Rousseau's question, to everything you've also brought up. And regarding that, I believe democracy is called to die and to be reborn, which seems to me to be something enshrined, I would say, in the very flow of the evolution of social systems. I have a sort of radical pessimism, or a radical optimism, in the sense that it's reborn, restarts. But I think there's an entropy of democracy, i.e. that it leads to the emergence of a mess. This makes it such that it self-destructs, as Beekler said, sometimes at the hands of the clerics, curiously, and not necessarily due to the masses or through corruption, which might be in play as well. So, that's all. See Castoriadis. I'm not going to revisit the question of monotheism. You've said what's essential. Whatever its importance was, the ideas relative to these questions remained dormant for centuries. Thus, henceforth we have to ask ourselves, why the devil were they reawakened at a given moment in time? L. Basley, you're doubtless thinking of the revival of Greek antiquity. See Castoriadis. It's before the revival of antiquity, it seems to me. I link this to the proto-bourgeoisie, to the constitution of free cities in the West, which we will come back to sometime, to the attempts at self-government in opposition to the central power and the luck they had in navigating between the king, the pope, feudalism, and so on. With respect to the question of contestation and of indeterminacy, yes and no. After all, if you will, indeterminacy for me. How to say it? As soon as I begin to talk about the radical imagination and the radical instituting imaginary, which means a spontaneous creativity proper to human beings, it becomes obvious that there is indeterminacy, and this indeterminacy is everywhere. It was there in Imperial China, it was in Stalinist Russia, and so on. But when exactly does it take on an actual substance? As soon as one exits from heteronomy. This is what you call the emancipation from the invisible. Yet, traditional societies are mythico-religious societies, or purely and simply traditional ones for that matter, and not necessarily religious in the proper sense of the term. In them, precisely speaking, there's no question of contesting the social law or the representation of the world created by the society. After all, those things are seen as a gift from the invisible, or as an imposition, a law of the invisible, or the like. And from this perspective, modern society contrasts sharply with all the others. Greek society occupies a particular position, not because it was a secular society, it was not, but, as I said a moment ago, because the religion there was civic religion, thus anticipating in a way Rousseau, and because it made up part of the functioning of the city. The Greeks, by the way, while being very pious most of the time, never dreamt for example of sending people to the Delphic oracle to ask, what laws should we make? They did, however, send emissaries to the oracle to ask all sorts of questions, even, where should we establish a colony? But not, is this law, or that other law, good? In other words, legislation was outside the domain of religion. Political society was outside the domain of religion. Now, is it such that as soon as there's democracy there's a mass formed, privatization, the gravity of power, and so on? Here, we diverge about the sociological observation and the like. I don't think those things are fated, and I don't think, in particular, that they're tied to the democratic composure of modern societies. This too is a very complicated discussion. There was a moment of struggle culminating in the revolutions against the Ancien regime at the end of the 18th century and even in a large part of the 19th. There was a collective participation in political combat, and democratic regimes were established in Europe as a function of popular struggles. These popular struggles were the struggles of the people. They were also the struggles of the petite bourgeoisie, since they, and not only the intellectuals, played a very important role in all the countries. It's true that starting at a certain point in time you have a retreat of the population, which I have referred to since 1960 as privatization. 45 But to say that this retreat is due to the democratic composure of this regime and that it was foreseen more or less by Tocqueville, recall that Tocqueville didn't observe it but made a prediction, since in his era it wasn't true, would be erroneous in my opinion. A whole series of factors trend at the time in the direction of a disappearance of the project of autonomy. The movement towards the extension of democracy, in particular in the social and economic domain, came to a halt at a certain point. There was also the role of Marxism. There was the expropriation of the popular labor movement by it. There was the evolution of parties claiming to adhere to Marxism, even if they were divided starting at a certain point between social democracy and Bolshevism, in both cases with catastrophic effects. And there was the bureaucratization of the labor movement. But the bureaucratization of the labor movement is not a phenomenon of democratization. That's completely an opposite thing. That's the expropriation of what in the beginning could have been a power, i.e. a control by the workers' collectives over the organizations, as with the first English syndicates, for example, and in other places too. That's the transition into bureaucratic organizations and the cornering of the power by the bureaucracy. Add to this the evolution we saw with Bolshevism, the experience of the communist parties, the schism in the labor movement, the conviction held by a large part of the working class that there was a paradise over there and that there were leaders who knew everything, the conviction held by another portion of the working class that it was a hell over there and that the Bolsheviks were emissaries of the devil, which was the situation in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in the United States for example. Hence, there was a collapse of the forms that could have appropriated the project of autonomy at just the moment when they wanted to carry that project beyond a narrowly defined political sphere, the sphere of rights, the right to vote, and so on. This factor combined with the capitalist movement proper, which means, say, the exact terminology is unimportant, consumer capitalism. This is a species of strange dialectic through which the workers imposed on the capitalist regime an elevation of the standard of living by way of imposing an enormous enlargement of the interior market, without which capitalism would have doubtless collapsed, as Marx had thought. And starting from that moment, with no conspiracy nor any conscious act, there was the explicit adoption by the capitalist regime of a politics of the enlargement of interior markets. And thus there were agreements to augment salaries, from which, if we throw in the lethargy and the collapse of the combative dimension, flowed the turn of the population towards consumerism, television, and so on. I believe this is a sociological evolution that is very, very complex. And I absolutely do not agree with blaming it on the egalitarian ideology, in Tocqueville's sense. Democracy. A. Kale, we're going to move on perhaps to the second question. See Castoriadis, yes. He reads Alain Kale's invitation letter. Another question, namely that of democracy. Here too I find you to be a bit too Hellenocentric. If democracy only ever existed in Athens, that's because it represents a political regime too improbable to be worth the effort of fighting for. What do you think of Beekler's theses concerning the naturalness of democracy? 46. Is there perhaps a Berber, Iroquois, or other democracy, or instead do the Greeks have the exclusive monopoly on it? First of all, the Greeks do not have the exclusive monopoly, since there are also the Western Europeans and the North Americans. There's no question of Hellenocentrism. Second, I disagree entirely with Beekler's theses, which I consider to be completely far-fetched, but I don't want to talk about them. I don't believe there would be a naturalness to democracy. I believe that there's a natural slide of human societies towards heteronomy, not towards democracy. There's a natural slide into looking for an origin and a guarantee of meaning elsewhere than in the activity of humans, for example in transcendent sources, or among ancestors, or in Hayek's version of it in the divine functioning of Darwinism across the market, which makes it such that the strong and the better always prevail in the long run, which is the same thing. 47. Is there some democracy among the Berbers? I directed a thesis on this people group that will be defended on Thursday. I don't think one can speak truly of a Berber democracy. That's a French ideological mirage from the end of the 19th century, bound up with the needs of colonization. They contrasted the Berbers, who were presented as true Europeans, with the Algerians. They even said the Berbers have the same heads as the Auvergne inhabitants, and their houses are built in the Auvergne style. They found in all of this a good basis for the French colonization of Algeria. Doubtless there was, if not a democracy, at least a collective power among the Iroquois, among other indigenous peoples, among the Zuni, at least if one believes Ruth Benedict. But what makes the difference? I believe that the difference with Athens, with Western Europe, is that in the case for example of the Iroquois or the Zuni, we're faced with something that's traditional, inherited, something that's simply there. It's the law of the tribe. It's not something one need change. The law of the tribe is that the collectivity exercises the power. Apart from that, there's nothing to change. In the tribes described by Clas, the chief has a decorative role. He's like a tape recorder reel that repeats, this is what our ancestors have laid down as law, it's the law of all, and it's a good law. The role of the chief is to chant that from morning to night, like a cockatoo could have done if someone had taught it to him. In short, there's no true leader. 48 But there's no putting things into question. There's no idea that the law comes from the collectivity. What comes from the collectivity is the government. Take the three functions of all power, to legislate, to judge, and to govern. The latter is not execution, which is a hypocritical term from modern constitutional laws. The government does not execute the laws, the government governs. To declare war is not to execute a law but to govern. To present the budget is not to execute a law, except in the formal sense, which says that the government, every year, presents the budget. But what's in the budget? The law says nothing, the Constitution says nothing. It's the government that decides, to the extent that it decides. Thus, of the three functions, the collectivity among the Iroquois exercises two of them, it judges, probably, and it governs, i.e. it decides to make or not to make war with the neighboring tribes. But it does not legislate. It does not institute. Yet, for me, democracy, and here we rejoin the discussion, if you will, with Leffert, is not indeterminacy. It's explicit self-institution. It's the fact of saying, as the Athenians said, edox te boul kai to demo, it seemed good to the council and to the assembly of the people, or, as is said in certain modern constitutions, sovereignty belongs to the people. 49 It's the people who are sovereign. Thus, the people can change the law, and in this respect it hardly matters if they don't change it, or if one subsequently adds that they exert it directly or by way of their representatives and that, after all, their representatives have everything cornered, and so on. It's this aspect that makes the difference, and I don't think there's a naturalness to democracy. Democracy is a very improbable regime, and a very fragile one, and that's precisely what shows that it's not natural. Now, if it's okay with you, I will move on to the other question: what are the chances today, according to you, of getting the forms of direct democracy recognized, and what relationship can they maintain with the representative system? A. Kale, I would like to pose yet another question on the present point. After all, obviously, if I asked you that question it's because it matters to me. I think Beekler's thesis is more defensible than you're saying it is, but I believe it's necessary to come to an understanding on some things. A huge part of the total incommunicability on the issue, in this type of debate, is found in that you, like Leffert for that matter, fundamentally define democracy as a process of autonomy, as a process of collective self-questioning. And you say, see Castoriadis, and of self-institution. A. Kale, and of self-institution. And you say, I was looking for a quotation from you and I did not find it, that, starting from the point when there is no explicit self-institution in ancient societies, there's no longer any question of talking about democracy. And you say more precisely that you don't intend to define democracy as a regime, as an institutional form. I think the whole debate lies here. See Castoriadis, that's not wholly accurate, but anyway. A. Kale, I didn't find the quotation. Let's say that you're more attentive, like Leffert, to the movement of interrogation, of self-institution, and of collective self-creation than to the form of the political regime. Thus, you don't want to lead the discussion into this terrain about the form of the political regime. That can be understandable. But, as I see it, this nevertheless has some inconvenient features, which are by the way the same as those I signaled just before during your debate over the place of the West in relation to the universe. After all, as soon as you start reasoning in that way, setting apart the democratic, Helleno-Western, European historical moment, at bottom you're positing that all political regimes, roughly speaking, are equally valid. In any case you don't introduce criteria for distinguishing between them. Yet, it seems to me that, nevertheless, there's a considerable difference between the diverse, non-Western forms of power. We agree fully that they're not founded on collective self-interrogation, self-creation, but there is a considerable difference between powers founded on brute, physical violence or symbolic violence, which is not easy to define, but that's another matter, and a power founded on some form or another of consent and often even on a certain unanimity. This is the basis of Beekler's argument. You say that for you the natural tendency of humanity is the tendency to heteronomy, and you doubtless add political heteronomy. See Castoriadis, total heteronomy. Why political? A. Kale, because we are speaking about politics at the moment. We're talking about democracy. That's why I say political heteronomy. After all, what you're saying is certainly true for the several recent millennia marked by the proliferation of forms of monarchy and empire. But Beekler's perspective consists in saying that this is, in the end, a relatively short historical period in light of the history of humanity. And he introduces with his reasoning a whole consideration of the primitive political regimes and the like. The question I'm asking you is this: can one define democracy uniquely through an explicit, self-instituting dynamic, and can one dispense with asking the question of the foundation of the collective obedience and the foundation of the power? Can we dispense with distinguishing between regimes founded on violence, pure and simple, and regimes founded on a certain acceptance? See Castoriadis. Let's understand well, there's a difference between regimes founded on acceptance and regimes founded on violence pure and simple. By saying what I was saying before, I did not intend to say that when one adopts a political perspective everything is the same and everything is equally valid. Yet on this point, I will come back to the question of the regime. There's an entirely fundamental misunderstanding, and here again we meet up with the discussion with Leffert. What goes on in a consensual democracy, let's put that in quotation marks since nobody has gone there to see it up close, after all, of the type found among the Iroquois? Well, there is a consensus. But consensus as such, contrary to what is thought, contrary to what we seem to think today, has no value. There can wholly be a consensus in a society that's completely hierarchical. A good feudalism is a society based on consensus, and everybody is in their place. And that's still the society in Comrie, according to Proust, where everybody was in their place and where a middle-class woman who married a noble transgressed as much as the noble who married a prostitute. She was just as despicable because she married outside of her status, outside of her place. All of that, it was the European reality not all that long ago, but in feudalism it's the same thing. Now, doubtless, a regime established on consensus may appear to us as preferable. Effectively, it's more humane, even though. There's a memorable text by Pierre Clas on the initiatory rights in primitive societies in which one sees the extreme violence that gets paid for entry into that egalitarian society. 50. A. Kale, there were limits. See Castoriadis, it happened in the jungle with nests of ants on the skin and so on. Me, I would very much like for that to be more humane. But that's not directly our problem. Our problem is, can we have a society that's truly free? A. Kale, it's a society, in Claster's sense, that's against domination. Nevertheless, there's a question. See Castoriadis, but where domination does exist, there's a heteronomy of a different type. And that's what Claes Trace failed to see. It was not his problem. Kale, he says it. You just recalled it? See Castoriadis, no, he doesn't see the foundation of the heteronomy. The society is against the state, but the society is in a certain sense for the transcendence of the source of its norms. And there, in the primitive societies he talks about, this transcendence is not a transcendence in the Western, metaphysical, Christian, Judeo-Christian sense or the like. It's the past of the societies, it's the word of the ancestors. And we have no power over that word. I would like to mention a radical misunderstanding when you say that for me democracy is not a regime. It surprises me since obviously you have read the text called Done and to be Done. 51 I think the source and perhaps the touchstone of all my divergences from Leffert are still found there. Things are entirely the contrary. Democracy is a regime. There's a description of the democratic regime that takes 5 pages at the end of that text. Democracy is a regime where there are rights, where there is habeas corpus, where there is direct democracy, and where the transformation of social and economic conditions permit the participation of citizens. I don't know whether it's necessary to agree about that. But I remind you that there's a description of the democratic regime, such as I have always thought of it and described it since Socialisme ou Barbarie, in the text called On the Content of Socialism. 52 Why? Because it's absurd to speak of a regime, of a society, that self-institutes, if there aren't already instituted forms that allow for self-institution. Otherwise, it has no meaning. And for that reason the discourse of indeterminacy is, in my view, empty. For society to be able to be effectively free, to be autonomous, for it to be able to change its institutions, it needs institutions that allow it to do that. What, for example, does freedom, or the possibility for citizens to participate, or the fact of rising up against the anonymity of a mass form of democracy mean if there isn't, in the society we're talking about, something, which has disappeared in the contemporary discussions, including those of Leffert for that matter, which is paideia, the education of the citizen. 53 It's not about teaching them arithmetic, it's about teaching them to be a citizen. Nobody is born a citizen. How do they become one? By learning to be. They learn it, firstly, by watching the city in which they are found, and certainly not through this television they watch today. Yet, that counts as part of the regime. A regime of education is necessary. An economic regime is also necessary, for that matter. If a Berlusconi over there or a Bouygues over here owns the means for mass communication, we can ask what freedom of information there is and whether it hasn't been terribly reduced. 54 It isn't being jeopardized by the police but by infinitely more efficacious means. Take for instance the abrupt change that occurred in the Eastern countries as soon as the formal dictatorship was abolished. Before that, there was an interest in politics, now there isn't any more. Why? Because, only at this level of civic cretinization and practically at no other level did they westernize themselves straight away. Immediately. In 15 days. 3 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall there were elections. The people who had fought against the regime got 0.4% of the vote. Those who had televisions from the West, and in particular Kohl and the Christian Democrats, got the majority. Now there's a return of the pendulum, but it's for completely bad reasons, or almost. Thus, democracy is for me a regime. I have just written, moreover, a text against Habermas and others called Democracy as Procedure and Democracy as Regime, where I say that democracy as procedure is meaningless because that procedure itself cannot exist as a democratic procedure if there are not institutional arrangements that allow for it as a regime. 55 And these institutional arrangements begin with the formation of the citizens and continue through the modalities that allow for inciting them to a maximal participation in the life that is political, collective, and so on. There's thus a radical misunderstanding here. And perhaps now you see better why Leffert, in his conception of indeterminacy, effectively refuse to say anything about democracy as a regime. That's not the case with me. Kale, sure enough, I didn't find the quotation I thought I had read. I was mistaken. I confused you for a moment with Lefford. I offer you my apology. Laughter. See Castoriadis, even if only visually, that would still be a bit much. Laughter. I think we're now cleared up on that point. I will come back to the line of your questions. What chance is there today according to you for getting forms of direct democracy recognized, and what relationship can they maintain with the representative system? In my view, there's no democracy except as direct. A representative democracy is not a democracy, and on this issue I agree not with Marx but with, among others, Rousseau. The English are free 1 day every 5 years, and so on. 56 and not even 1 day every 5 years because by that day the die is cast. We're going to elect a president of the Republic next spring. What will freedom of the French be? It will be that of choosing between Balladur and Chirac, or Balladur and Delors. 57 That's all. The big argument against direct democracies in modern societies concerns the size of these societies. Yet the argument is made in bad faith, historically, concretely, and politically. Why historically? The representative regime as we practice it was unknown in antiquity. The ancients had magistrates, there were no representatives. 58 As far as I'm concerned, I'd like to have the magistrates. I would like to elect revocable magistrates and so on, but I don't want to be represented. I consider that to be an insult. The representative regime appeared in the medieval West. There was a very good book by the late Yves Barrel, La Ville Medievale, that described the evolution of medieval society in this respect. 59 This regime appeared as of the 11th or 12th centuries in the cities that tended to self-govern. These cities counted perhaps 3,000 or 6,000 citizens, which makes up a tenth of the 30,000 to 40,000 active citizens in Athens in the classical period, of which half undoubtedly assembled in the ecclesia, and perhaps more when there were big decisions to make. 60 Yet they did not elect magistrates, they elected representatives. The idea of representation is thus a modern idea, and its rootedness in political heteronomy and political alienation is obvious. What are they, representatives? The term has become intransitive over time, but in the beginning it was transitive. The representatives are the representatives to and for the power. Thus, the fact of electing representatives presupposes that there's a king, and this is the classic case in England, for example, to and for whom one sends one's representatives. And the king governs. The king in his parliament is not an absolute monarch, it's the king in his parliament with the representatives of his subjects. This therefore has nothing to do with the size of the populace. And the proof of this is that one can ask the question from a different angle. In a modern nation, one says, there can't be direct democracy. Why can't there be direct democracy in a city of, say, 100,000 inhabitants, meaning 50,000 active citizens? It's not the size that's to blame, since in Athens this democracy was possible all while there were 40,000 active citizens. One could thus say, let's establish direct democracy in units gathering 40,000 active citizens. But no, nobody raises the question from that angle. The argument from size is thus wholly sophistical and in bad faith. I can't go into the critique of the representative regime here. It's been done 1,000 times, and there's nothing new to add. The true argument for representative democracy, we mustn't forget, is that of Benjamin Constant in The Liberty of the Ancients compared with that of the moderns, dating from about 1820, and already sketched out by Ferguson in an essay on the history of civil society, in about 1770. 61 These people were not ideologues or theoreticians in bad faith, they were political people with their feet on the ground. What's the argument? It's that in modern societies what interests people is not the management of common affairs but the guarantee of their enjoyments. Those are Constant's terms, but Ferguson already said more or less the same thing. Constant adds that the majority of people in modern society, and this is an entirely Aristotelian argument, are occupied with the benausic trades, which he would have said if he spoke Greek, i.e. mind-numbing trades, like with industry workers. 62 And as a result, it's entirely normal that there would be a censitary suffrage and that the only persons who vote are those who, through their way of life, have the leisure to reflect on public affairs and to occupy themselves with them. What remains is the real question of direct democracy at the scale of modern societies, nations, perhaps continents, or even of the entirety of humanity. I don't have a response concerning the institutional forms that it could adorn. All I'm saying is that we will find, in the creations of the great political and social movements of the modern era, the germs of forms of regimes that allow for a direct democracy. For example, consider the form of the Paris Commune, or of the Soviets, the true ones, before they were domesticated by the Bolsheviks, or of the workers' councils. Consider ones with an actually effective, as great as possible, power of the General Assemblies, which means direct democracy for the ultimate decisions and, in a subsidiary way, as we would say now, a power for the delegates. But these delegates would obviously be elected and revocable at any instant and thus unable to expropriate the collectivity of its power. But, in all this, once again, I think that if there must be a democracy, it can only be direct. And it will not be able to be unleashed except from an enormous popular movement involving the great majority of the society. There's a creativity of society that, alone, is adequate to a problem of this type. If the society can't find forms for the exercise of power that are truly democratic, whether it be those I sketched or others that are perhaps more efficacious, then there will be nothing to be done. There will be, once again, a representative regime and, once again, what Marx called the backslide into all the old rubbish, i.e. into the expropriation of power by the representatives, by the possessors, by the media people today, and the like. That's all for that question. J. Do it. In what was said just now, I recognize your positions, which I have known for a very long time. But I'm still surprised by what appears more and more to be there radically. In the end you draw things up into a sharp alternative. You give an extreme form to the idea of autonomy, to the extent that if that's the case, then we arrive at no longer being able to recognize any institution or representation as having a value proper, even if only provisory. There is, on the one hand, a pure autonomy and, on the other hand, every form of institutionalization or representation. Yet those things do indeed make up a part of political history. All exteriority is, if that's the case, discredited. I will take us back to a point a bit earlier in the discussion that had to do with the laws, with the example of the Iroquois. You had recounted your fundamental concept, your fundamental philosophical position, namely explicit self-institution. And I was saying to myself, well, it's perhaps trivial to say it, my apologies, but can we not conceive that one could freely recognize the laws as good? Must this idea of autonomy lead necessarily to a sort of compulsion to change? Here is where there risks being a slide between the exigency for freedom and autonomy, and something else perhaps. It seems to me that we need to look deeper into this aspect. You yourself recognize that there is no pure act of self-institution. You recognize just before that there is a limit to our power of action. So, this is also tied to our finitude. We inscribe ourselves in a tradition. We recognize that the world existed already before us. In that case, isn't there a possibility specifically that we may recognize certain laws as good without having the absolute need to change them, even if we do reserve for ourselves this possibility, if it's necessary? See Castoriadis. I'm afraid there's yet another misunderstanding. I take myself to be very bad, undoubtedly, at explicating my positions, since very often I do not recognize myself in the critiques that are made of me. Or else I'm blind about myself. I believe that I am, as much as one can be, autonomous in the domain of thought. I'm talking about myself, Castoriadis. What do I mean by that? I certainly do not mean that there is a compulsion for me to change and that every morning I get up, I take everything I have written, I flip through it, and I say to myself, I wrote that, so it can no longer be true, so it must be changed. No. Absolutely not. To be autonomous, for me, means that I continue to think, that I have new ideas from time to time, that I hope I continue to have them, unless Alzheimer's catches up to me, and that I give myself the right to say in writing, as it has occurred to me to do before, that what I wrote in such and such a place was false or insufficient and that it's necessary to look back over it and go further. And I have done that. You know my career. I started by being Marxist. Then, first, I rejected Marx's economics, then his theory of labor and technology, then his sociology, then his conception of history and his philosophy. And I set out to reinterpret the history of philosophy, to reject a lot of things that I had accepted and so on, and I continue to do that. And I could say the same thing with respect to Freud, for example, whom I respect enormously. I'm a psychoanalyst. But as for where I am now, there are very few things that are literally from Freud in what I think, in what I do, in what I say in the domain of psychoanalysis. It's like that. There's no compulsion to change. And I don't think of an autonomous society as dominated by a compulsion to change. What is autonomy? It's when one may at each moment say, is this law just? Heteronomy is when the question shall not be raised, as one says in the courts. The question will not be asked. It's forbidden. If you are a believing Jew, you cannot ask the question, are the prescriptions of Exodus or Deuteronomy just or not? The question has no meaning. It has no meaning because the name of God is justice and because these laws are the word of God. So, to say that it's unjust is to say that the circle is square. There you have it. This is the most extreme and most evolved, the most subtle and most grandiose formulation. But the same thing holds for all heteronomous societies. It's thus not a matter of daily putting the totality of the existing legislative arrangements onto the Assembly's order of the day and of inviting the population to reprove them or to change them. It's simply a matter of making room for the possibility, the effective possibility, of course, that the institutions can be altered without barricades, torrents of blood, havoc, and everything else being necessary for that. Now, you say that all institutionalization is excluded. I say precisely the contrary. An autonomous society is a society that has institutions of autonomy, for example the magistrates. I said a while back that I accept these magistrates, and that not only do I accept them but I defend their necessity. It's only required that they be revocable. The whole question resides in this able irrevocable, and we see here to what enormous extent effective history surpasses all of our discussions. Because, of course, we have to write into the Constitution the clause, all magistrates are revocable by their mandators. One would inscribe that into the democratic society as I conceive of it. But this clause in itself means nothing. First of all, it may be that the magistrates are irreproachable, or in any case excellent, and that therefore we let them accomplish their mandates and we re-elect them and so on. But it may also be that the people start to not give a damn and that therefore, as we have seen many times in strikes, student movements, and so on, the magistrates, the delegates, the representatives, the secretaries get entrenched. This is not necessarily because they want to get entrenched but because others say, oh, there's Dewitt, there's Kale, there's Latouche, they'll get us out of this mess. As for us, let's go to the movies. Yet, what institutional measure do you want to enact against that? Of course, you can enact some institutional measures, as with certain ones that already exist. But we see what they lead to. It's certain that even if the magistrates get entrenched because the mandators don't exercise their right to revoke them, these magistrates cannot just do whatever they want. After all, there are courts, there's the Council of State, there's the Court of Audit, and so on. We see every day in the newspapers to what extent these means of control are weak. It's necessary to maintain such guardrails, of course, but they're not what's going to resolve the problem. The only solution is the activity of people. But we can't see in this activity a miracle that will either self-produce or not self-produce. The desire and the capacity of citizens to participate in political activities are themselves a political problem and a political task. And, in part, these things pertain to the institutions that induce them, that prescribe and create the citizens as carried towards that activity, and not towards the guarantee of their enjoyments. There you have it. That's what we must institutionalize. A. Kale, to the audience. No more questions. As for me, I'd like to return to a question. I'm sorry, but there are questions I've wanted to ask you for a long time. Since I have you at hand, I'll shamelessly take advantage. Chantal. Chantal Mauve, yes, I'd like to return to this question. After all, I have a lot of sympathy for your positions. But it's really here that things get stuck. I would be disposed to accept, with you, that there cannot be any democracy except a direct one. Let's admit that. But immediately I'm going to say where the limitations are. I agree wholly that the argument from size is a bad faith argument. But I will, despite all of that, set out to defend what I would call the representative system, based in no way on arguments from size, nor in the least on arguments from Benjamin Constant. I believe that, at bottom, we have not yet truly elaborated the political philosophy that could justify the system, the representative regime, and that we would have to find an argument from another angle, which would have more to do with the defense of individual freedom. Let me explain. There's no democracy except a direct one, agreed. But does democracy guarantee individual freedom? In order to be able to guarantee it, isn't it rightly necessary to have, alongside the democratic institutions, other institutions that would have more to do with what I would call the question of pluralism? And thus, at bottom, this is why for me the best regime is always a mixed regime. In your position, in Rousseau's position, there's likewise something that worries me. Doesn't it rest on the idea that, at bottom, the one people, when they are going to decide directly within this representative democracy, are necessarily going to choose policies and make decisions that are going to guarantee the freedom of all? Isn't that basically the question raised by people like Stuart Mill? It's here, in what I call political liberalism, that there is, all the same, something important for thinking democracy today, namely the defense of minorities. After all, Switzerland is a much more democratic regime than lots of others, but that doesn't prevent it from making decisions that, regarding immigrants for example, are nevertheless very problematic. Doesn't your position in effect presuppose some kind of good unity which makes it such that, if we can decide entirely together, we are necessarily going to make good decisions? But I don't believe that. And that's why, alongside this democracy, institutions are necessary that aren't democratic. It's agreed that they aren't democratic, but which will rightly allow for guaranteeing, in certain conditions, individual freedom and a certain pluralism. See Castoriadis. I'm going to respond to this, but are there other questions? A. Kale, a while back I was on the same trail as Chantal Mauve. Personally, I'm wholly attached to this demand for direct democracy. It has totally disappeared from the French intellectual landscape for a long time now. We never hear it spoken of anymore, except by you. I believe it's totally foundational. Yet I myself struggle with your formulation, since I don't think direct democracy can take the place of a regime of representative democracy. It seems to me that we have to re-establish it not in place of but as complementary to a representative democracy regime, more or less because of the reasons Chantal Mauve just gave. Why is a representative democracy regime, which one may speak of as not democratic, nevertheless necessary? We can already see why, for de facto reasons. You alluded to the experiences of the Soviets. They did not last very long, for reasons that need to be analyzed and which are not a great mystery. What's the fundamental reason? What was direct democracy based on in the ancient era? It was based fundamentally on autochthony. It was based on the fact that the people had come from a like origin, from a like race, from a like culture, from a like soil, and on the fact that they shared common values, and that this made possible the unity of political decision. There's a problem faced by modern democracies, after the loss of a relative social homogeneity, which is also what Rousseau imagines, whose democracy is one of small producers. The question of modern democracies is simple. It arises right at the moment when there is no more autochthony, no more unity, no more economic, cultural, or social homogeneity, and when groups that are entirely different have to be put into relation. The question comes up at a meta level, and it seems that it can't be solved any longer only through direct democracy. Another dimension is necessary, which could be the mixed regime. An appeal to something else is necessary. And you yourself said, moreover, that the institutions that create direct democracy are necessary. Of course. But that means this institution is not founded on direct democracy. See Castoriadis. First of all, direct democracy, the democratic regime I'm thinking of, is not a paradise on earth. It's not the perfect regime, and I don't know what perfect regime means. It's not a regime that is immunized, by design, against every error, aberration, folly, or crime. The Athenians committed them, and the French in 1793 as well. In North America it was a bit less extreme, but nevertheless. So this is not about that. But if we bring up this point, we must not forget that errors, aberrations, folly, and crimes were committed in overabundance by other regimes, including by representative regimes. The anti-red laws in the United States, for example, were voted in with all regularity by the House of Representatives and the Senate. I wrote a statement a few years ago that is perhaps, out of everything I've written, the thing I prefer the most. Nothing and nobody can protect humanity from its own madness. 63 Democracy can't, and still less so can monarchy, since monarchy consists in the madness of the monarch, in Louis XV, in the cabal. Now, the defense of individuals and of minorities. But I wholly agree. I will turn back once more to done and to be done. 64 We need reinforced arrangements, i.e. constitutional ones in the sense that their revision is subject, for example, to more restrictive conditions, to qualified majorities, if you will, to longer delays for reflection. These guarantee individual liberties, which we today call rights, and which comprise a habeas corpus, rules, e.g. like the one that ever since the Romans has said that there's no crime nor penalty without prior law. And all of this can and must be enhanced, since all of it is insufficient. One could just as well formulate arrangements defending minorities, different categories of minorities, and these arrangements could make up part of the Constitution. But are you proposing that we should have a Constitution that couldn't under any condition be revised? No, of course not. After all, the Constitution, even if it doesn't anticipate it, will be revised by the force of arms. We're at no less than the Fifth French Republican Constitution, not to mention the intermediate monarchical constitutions. I don't know how many countries have had 40 constitutions, which have all become scraps of paper. The idea of a non-revisable constitution is at once concretely and logically absurd. Just as you can't prevent the Swiss from using referendum to restrain the entry of migrants, you can never prevent the people, one day, and I'm going to say something deliberately ridiculous, from saying, all individuals of less than 1.6 meters or of more than 1.9 meters are deprived of the right to vote. Since the other people are in the crushing majority, they could very well carry out that arrangement. What are you going to do? As for me, I would be against it. I would fight to the death against such an arrangement. I would try to rouse the people against it. If you admit a majority rule, you necessarily admit that, despite all guarantees, there's always the possibility that the people may go crazy and do this or that. Hitler was not brought to power by a majority, but he might as well have been. Now, what should have been done about that? Deprive the Germans of the right to vote? That's what the movement of history is. We can fight against it, but we cannot guarantee ourselves against it through juridical arrangements. But what I absolutely do not see, and what seems to me to be truly a fallacy in your reasoning, and in KLS, is how the fact that the democracy would be representative, and not direct, constitutes a supplementary guarantee. We have right now in the United States a Congress that's preparing itself, if it dares, to do monstrosities. 65 I believe that what you are saying corresponds to an ideological tradition of the reinterpretation of antiquity, which was one of the two between which the West has oscillated. This consisted in depicting the Athenian demos in its moments of folly, condemning the generals from Arginusi, or making some other such monstrous decision, all while forgetting all the other decisions that the same demos made over 100 years, which culminated in a certain number of marvels with which we're all familiar. 66 The Athenian demos had moments of folly, but there were elected chambers of representatives that have had them equally and that made bad decisions. I don't see in what respect, and I implore you to reflect on this, a representative regime would guarantee individual liberties to a greater extent. It's not representatives who guarantee individual liberties, it's constitutional arrangements. And if the Constitution holds, if we then have the certainty that, for example, in the United States or in France, the restoration of slavery is impossible or, nothing is impossible, extremely improbable, then this is not because the Constitution says so. We would be cretins to think that. It's because we know that if there were a proposal for the restoration of slavery, a crushing majority of people would be ready to fight so that this restoration would not take place. You, and Kale too, associate me with Rousseau. Yet I have nothing to do with Rousseau on this issue. While it has often occurred to me to cite the sentence where Rousseau criticizes representative democracy, I absolutely do not agree with his conceptions about the general will, the banning of factions, and so on. I have nothing to do with all that. But I believe that there's nonetheless something in what you said that is very important and that is worth explicating. And here, there's a difference between modern democracy, between modern regimes, and the ancient regime. It's the conception of the representatives as representatives of particular interests. This aspect is effectively modern, and in a sense I'm against it. This would be a very long discussion, but I will re-employ an example that I like a lot. There was an arrangement in the Athenian laws, mentioned by Aristotle in the Politics, I believe, which said that whenever the assembly of the people had to decide to make or not make war against another bordering city, the citizens dwelling in the frontier regions didn't have the right to participate in the vote. 67 Why? Because they couldn't vote honestly, or else they'd be put into a double bind, which leads to psychosis. Either they vote as citizens while forgetting the fact that their olive groves are going to be destroyed, their houses burned, and so on, and that's something harmful, or they vote as owners of houses, olive groves, and so on, and they could care less about the interests of the city. Yet, it's the second case that gets actualized constantly in contemporary society. We say of the representatives that they're representatives of the people, but that's not the case. Look at what happens in reality. A little bit of concrete sociology is necessary, in the end. What are the American Congress people? What are the French deputies? What do they defend above all? They defend the sectarian interests of their electors. The American Congress will say that it's necessary to support credits for Boeing because of Seattle, state of Washington, that it's necessary to support such and such base in Texas because it gives work to 10,000 people in the region, and so on. And here, we're talking about real people, but there are also more consistent interests. Behind the current representation there's the recognition of conflicting interests in society, and there's this idea that through representation, through this regime of indirect democracy, the interests can negotiate compromise solutions between themselves. What's the result? It's the current situation where, in effect, there are compromises, or give and take, Yes, agreed, you shall have such an augmentation of agricultural subsidies on the condition that you accept this. And that's the total political powerlessness of the parliamentarians, i.e. the reason making it such that no decision is made, such that all the politicians talk about the necessary reforms and they never get them done. Now, I agree with you in saying that we can't ignore the existence of particularities in society, that we can't speak in terms of unified society, that we must find a way so that these rights should be safeguarded as much as is reasonable. But it's necessary to maintain, and on this I am completely intransigent, the unity of the political body as a political body which has in view the general interest of society and not, for example, those of the wine growers of the Midi. The wine growers of the Midi are very respectable and they need to be protected, but we can't put them above the interests of the collectivity as a whole. See mouth, quickly. I would like to clarify what I meant because I agree totally with your response. I do not at all want to defend the representative system such as it exists today, since it's certain that what's in play are particular interests. But I was thinking of a representative democracy to come. And thus what would this democratic regime to come, for which we want to struggle, rightly be? As for me, I believe it wouldn't rightly be a direct democracy regime but a representative democracy regime wherein the conflict would play out over the question, not of the conflict of interests, but of the conflict over the different interpretations of the common good. After all, I believe, and this is also what Alain said, that the big difference, in my view, between today's situation and the Greek situation is the question of homogeneity, the question of pluralism. And we can't take it as obvious, self-evident as one says in English, that there is a single and like interpretation of the general interest that's more just than another. I agree entirely with you concerning the critique of the current society. But I believe that the society we want to struggle for would be a society in which the parties would rightly play a different role and would not be the representatives of particular interests. It's one in which the question would play out over the different interpretations of what the common good is. There's not just one single idea of the general interest, and it's rightly necessary to make room for conflict concerning these different interpretations. Thus, this would be a representative democracy that does not exist, of course. A. Kale, a representative democracy that does not exist, a direct democracy that does not exist either. See Castoriadis, that's perfect. We're going in the right direction, since we're talking about what should exist and not the miserable current reality. But what we're calling the general interest, or the common good of the political body. See mouth, it's not definable. It's a horizon. See Castoriadis, certainly. It is not definable by a philosopher, by a Plato, nor by a Nicholas Luhmann writing a theory of social systems, and even less so by a computer. 68 We're totally in agreement. But it is open for discussion by the citizens, and only the citizens can discuss it and then decide. 69 We thus have to ask ourselves, what are the questions that pertain to the general interest, and thus to political decision? And what are those that only concern, for example, the private sphere and aren't political in the strong sense of the term? Take homosexuality. In the United States, at least in certain states, it's considered as a crime, since the law is based on an arrangement that's found, I believe, in Leviticus 70. But when Napoleon had to deal with homosexuality, he considered that it pertained to the private life of people and that politics didn't need to legislate on the matter. That's also my opinion, of course. Another example, is the question of the equality of men and women a question of the general interest? For me, yes, incontestably. It's thus a political question. You may well repeat the words pluralism or cultural difference, but you'll have to establish the limits beyond which this pluralism is no longer valid. I'll reemploy once again a caricatured example, as that's a habit of mine and of my ancestor Socrates too, namely the right to kill those who don't please you. Is that a matter of cultural difference? Does the society in which we live admit as honorable the activity of head hunting, itself very honorable in certain tribes? A voice, among the Dayak people. See Castoriadis, among the Dayak people, yes, notably. We say, and this is a political decision. No, this isn't a cultural difference, or, this is a cultural difference that isn't tolerable. In our society it's forbidden to kill. Now, as I already said jokingly, we can imagine a society rich enough to reserve a certain number of uninhabited islands of the Pacific for people who want to live as headhunters, or like in the 120 Days of Sodom. 71 Perfect. They freely go about killing themselves. Kale, you'll even furnish the victims. See Castoriadis, yes, those who really want to be. Reread the preface by Paul Hahn to Story of O, with voluntary slavery and so on. 72 They'll be the ones to go live there. And if they lack victims, the butcherers will carry out massacres among themselves. But let's go back to what's essential, to the political decision. Contrary to what Plato thinks, there is no political episteme, that is a domain that pertains to Dasein, to opinion. And, above all, democracy is such that all the Dasein go head to head there freely, and only majority rule permits one to decide legitimately between them. We don't highlight this enough. The only foundation of majority rule is that in politics all the Dasein are equivalent. And there's no procedural escape hatch of this type. Now discussion shall cease, we'll put all the opinions in a hat and we'll make a random draw. No. The number of opinions in favor of such a decision has a weight and creates a presumption of rectitude. But whether this majority would be acquired by referendum or by the vote of representatives, at this level I don't see the difference. The representatives will say, headhunters aren't tolerated here. And the majority of the people will say the same thing. I don't see how you can pull from that an argument for representative democracy, against direct democracy. Now, let's improve the devices for the protection of minorities. Of course. But it will surely be necessary to find a majority to define which minorities may legitimately make a claim for the said protection. And I hope we agree, women are not a minority from this perspective, that problem comes up elsewhere. But time is getting on, and if we want Kale, we aren't forced to keep to the whole program. See Castoriadis, so, we're going to stop there? That's quite alright, go ahead. Anne-Marie Fixat, you say that what's to be prioritized is the single, general interest and that it's open for discussion by the citizens. But the difficulty is that it's necessary to put the citizens into a position, or at least into a relation, for discussion. And that's what poses a problem for me today, since I realize that, as you said just before, many people lose interest in it and are indifferent. But it's also the case that certain people, given their socio-economic condition, can't manage to assume their place with regard to the general interest. What's to be done? How are we to think about this democracy to come? What's the role of information, of everyday education, not simply for children but equally for ourselves? And above all, what types of citizenship relations can we consider so as to succeed at having the general interest be taken into account effectively by the totality of the body of citizens and not simply by some people, even in the case of direct democracy? See Castoriadis, that's the fundamental problem. I am entirely in agreement with you. The participation of the citizens, at all levels of society, is not a matter in which it suffices to wait for a miracle. We must work at it intensively, introduce institutional arrangements that facilitate it. The central element, I repeat, is paideia, education. School is only a small part of it. Even Plato knew that, saying that the walls of the city educate the citizens. 73 That's perfectly true, but so little put into practice. Now, when you evoke the socio-economic conditions, I fear that we would need to have another meeting, since we will never manage to finish today. It would be necessary to deal with the enormous problem of the economic and productive structure of society as well as the objective of economic activity. A.M. Fixat, lots of those who don't participate in political life say, we're in such a situation of exclusion, How could we even think about the general interest? See Castoriadis. Of course, there are exclusions. But there is also concrete apathy with many people. And even if certain of them were to have some interest in politics, they would not truly have the time to be occupied with it actively. The entire structure of society tends to prevent them from participating, and that stretches all the way from the structure of work to what one calls law. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. You were surely thinking of the amusing paradox that this adage so badly conceals. So, in court you're supposed to know everything and, at the same time, if your affair is the slightest bit complicated you will surely get a lawyer. That's someone who after 4 or 5 years of studies has specialized for still 3 or 4 more years in maritime law, in the law of this or that. That's an absurd situation, to which one can oppose the ancient system wherein all the laws were written on the marble, exposed. Everyone knew how to read and could get familiar with them. Our society is too complex for it to be able to be like that. But why should one have to submit to this complexity like a fate? What is important to us? Why should it be necessary to accept like a fate what historical evolution has given as, let's say, a spontaneous product, for example this capitalist society of the late 20th century, with its enormous legislative complexity, which in the United States allows lawyers to earn more money than the industrialists they defend. And the aberrant modes of production, the walls covered with advertisements, and television such as it's imposed on us? Can we truly never call all of that into question? And why not invert things and say, we want a system of law such that every citizen can understand it and make do with it, we want an economic and productive system such that all the producers can participate in one way or the other in the management of production. Do you see what I'm saying? What divine decree would impose upon us factories wherein 50,000 workers, mind-numbed by their work, as Benjamin Constant said, would produce such types of products in such a way? A market economy that, in order to function well, requires a level of joblessness going up to 12 to 15% of the population? We can invert all of that and start by saying, we want a society in which all the citizens can participate in the common affairs. And in the face of that demand, there are practically no more indisputable givens. Our juridical system is contestable because it's anti-democratic. Our system of production is contestable because it gets imposed by way of mind-numbing the workers for 40 hours or more per week. Given these things, it's ridiculous to believe that there will be a Sunday full of political activity. It's necessary perhaps to invert the problem, to radicalize it, and to ask ourselves what society we really want. Latouche, it's clear that we have the response to your question of what society we want. By an immense majority, we want cars, washing machines, refrigerators, and so on. As President Bush said, the American standard of living is not negotiable. 74 Let nature die, but the American standard of living will remain as it is. And as a result we want the system to continue as it is, and at bottom we don't give a damn at all whether it's democratic or not. We don't completely not give a damn either, which means that we want, at once, to have our cake and eat it too. We want refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, along with all that the system implies with respect to the dispossession of the citizen of political life by the techno-economic mega-machine. But may we not, despite everything, while remaining Aristotelian, recover the principle of the lesser evil? That's not the same as saying that the system would be managed by a totalitarian bureaucracy or that it would be managed by corrupt representatives in a parliament such as it is. There is, nevertheless, a relative good. See Castoriadis, obviously. Backed into a corner, if I'd had to choose between the extension of Soviet power such as it was in Europe and the maintenance of our rotten democracies, I would have been ready even to fight for the defense of these democracies. But I thought we were talking now about what the aim of politics should be. In May, there'll be a presidential election. I don't believe that I will vote. But if I should vote, it would not be for Balladur, for example. A. Kale, for Chirac. Laughter. See Castoriadis, neither. Nor for Arlet, for that matter. 75 Laughter. But, in the end, I truly act in the relative here, like when I want to take the shortest route to go into the countryside. Latouche, throughout this discussion there's an obstacle that Alain tried to raise at the start, but which we didn't reconsider subsequently in the debate and which we tend to forget. It's that we've been calling into question the entire economization of society and that, in fact, all of your reasoning presupposes that the economic imaginary has been completely decolonized. See Castoriadis, do you have with you a copy of Fait et Affaire? 76 Allow me, even if it is rather improper to cite oneself, to end this part of the discussion with a quotation. We thus arrive at the Gordian knot of the political question today. An autonomous society cannot be established except through the autonomous activity of the collectivity. Such an activity presupposes that people strongly invest in something other than the possibility of buying a new color television. More profoundly, it presupposes that the passion for democracy and for freedom, for communal affairs, will take the place of distraction, cynicism, conformism, and the race to consume. In short, it presupposes, among other things, that the economic stops being the dominant or exclusive value. To respond to Frankfurter, this is the price to be paid for a transformation of society. Let us put it even more clearly, the price to pay for freedom is the destruction of the economic as a central and, in fact, unique value. Is this too high a price? For me, certainly not. I infinitely prefer having a new friend over a new car. This is a subjective preference, of course. But objectively, I willingly leave to the political philosophers the task of founding, consumption as the supreme value. But there is something more important. If things continue on their present course, this price will have to be paid anyway. Who can believe that the destruction of the earth will be able to continue at its present pace for another century? Who fails to see that it would accelerate further still if the poor countries were to industrialize? And what will the regime do when it cannot keep the populations in check by furnishing them constantly with new gadgets? 77. I believe this text responds to your remark, or at least goes in the direction of your remark. I propose that we end here, since everyone has to be tired. As for me, in any case, I am. J. Do it, one little remark, nevertheless, that I wanted to make a while back. There's one of your writings that I've always appreciated, which is for me a very beautiful text, namely Development and Rationality, which came out in Esprit, I believe. 78 Indeed, a very particular passage where you evoke the gesture of the Greek man who planted an olive tree. See Castoriadis, a cypress tree. J. Do it, I forgot that. Yes, because, moreover, in the olive tree there's something. See Castoriadis, indeed, it was his daughter's dowry. When she turns 20, they'll cut down this cypress tree in order to make the mast of a boat from it. J. Do it, what surprises me is that, in an encounter between Castoriadis and the Moss group, this aspect was not expanded upon. In this, after all, there's surely something like an economy that's otherwise than rational, that's a wager on the future, i.e. the foundation of a temporality that's not about immediate returns. Yet, that's exactly the way that I also understand the reflection that Alain rightly engaged in, the interpretation of the idea of the gift. It implies something like a transcendence, something that also goes beyond immediate interest. But then one gets into more of an ethical discussion or even metaphysical, which would be a different debate than this one, a debate to which I'm perhaps personally more amenable. See Castoriadis, we're engaging above all in a discussion about the ends of human life. But I agree entirely. I don't believe there can be politics without a certain position regarding the ends of human life. That takes us back to the question of pluralism. We're backed into a corner today. We can't continue to talk about indeterminacy or even simply the divergence of options. The ends of human life are realized by contemporary society in a certain form. The ends of human life, it's about the new television next year. That's it? Now, is this reality what we want? In any case, as Serge said, it's effectively what the majority wants at the moment. Lotouche, the immense majority. See Castoriadis, the immense majority. Even those who aren't there are racing to get there, Eastern Europe, the underdeveloped countries. Yet this is incompatible with a true democracy, and it's even less and less compatible, in my view, with the truncated democracy we currently have. Regarding what you're saying about the traditional Greek peasant, I'm completely in line with your view. After all, I myself cited at the beginning of our discussion that quasi-autarkic Greek village on the island of Tinos. Let's be clear, this allows us to express the core of the problem, but it wouldn't be a matter of a pure and simple return to the past. I'll take the liberty of directing you back, one last time, to another of my writings, reprinted in Le Monde Morciel, specifically Dead End. With a question mark. 79. Above all, it's about this autonomized race of technoscience with its industrialist and consumerist dimension, of course, but also with its purely scientific technical aspect. We find more or less all of this in the interview with the doctor and biologist Jacques Testart in Liberation. 80. He was asked, do you think that, following the wishes of Madame Badinter, will one day make it possible for men to be pregnant, to bear a pregnancy? 81. He responded, after having resigned from those boards dealing with artificial insemination, I know there are labs in Chicago that are working in it. I can't tell you if it will be done or not, but I can tell you one thing, if it can be done, it will be done. 82. There you have it. Contemporary technoscience. We don't ask ourselves whether we need something but only if we can do it. And if we can do it, then we do it. And subsequently we find a need, or we create one. It's certain that we cannot continue in this fashion. But it's also certain that we can't purely and simply say we'll destroy everything and restart from zero. We are the first society in which the question of a self-limitation in the advancement of technologies and knowledges is proposed, not for religious or other reasons, nor political ones in the totalitarian sense. Stalin decreed that the theory of relativity is anti-proletarian, but for reasons of phronesis in Aristotle's sense. 83. It's for reasons of prudence in the profound sense of the term. And I insist, I'm talking about the limitation not only of technology but also of science. What's essential in it, after all, is the notion of what's doable. And that's where that question becomes extremely difficult, including for me. After all, I would very much like an even more powerful Hubble to allow us to know if there were or weren't proto-galaxies 15 billion years ago. That's a problem I'm passionate about. But the Hubbles and the satellites imply the totality of science and modern technology. Where are we going to lay down the limit, and who is going to lay it down, and on what grounds? Now that's a genuine question.